Hey guys, tonight we're diving deep into the often overlooked, surprisingly complex world of a medieval craftsperson. Picture this. The air is sharp, carrying the scent of damp earth, distant wood smoke, and something else, a faint, almost imperceptible vibration. A collective hum that speaks of tireless work and golden rewards. You're not in a castle, not clad in shining armor. You're someone far more vital to the sweetness and light of the age. But don't get too romantic about it. If you were actually here with medieval sanitation, healthcare, and the ever-present threat of a rogue goose attack, you probably wouldn't survive this, or at least not with all your teeth. It was a tough life, no doubt. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. It genuinely helps the channel find other history buffs like us. And hey, why not drop your location and what time it is where you are in the comments below. It's always cool to see where everyone's tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The first hint of gray is just beginning to bleed into the inky blackness of the sky outside your small, shuttered window. You feel it more than see it. A subtle shift in the quality of the silence. A damp chill that seeps through the wattle and daub walls of your cottage. Your mattress, a lovingly stuffed sack of straw that's seen more seasons than you have, offers its lumpy welcome to the waking world. It's not exactly memory foam, unless the memory is of every single stalk that's ever poked you in the ribs. You blink, and for a moment, the only sound is the gentle rustle of your own breathing under the coarse woolen blanket. Then it begins. Faint at first, a delicate thrumming that seems to resonate deep within your chest. It's a sound others in the village might not even register, lost as it is beneath the crowing of a distant, over-enthusiastic rooster, or Goodman Giles's hacking cough from the cottage next door as he stirs his own fire. But for you, this sound is an overture. It's the collective voice of your charges, your livelihood, your quiet obsession. The bees. You lie still for a few moments longer, letting the awareness of them settle in. Are they agitated? Calm? Is the hum strong and vibrant? Or does it carry a note of distress? This is your first pre-dawn assessment, a skill honed over years of listening. You're not just a tender of insects. You're a connoisseur of their collective mood, your unique calling. Slowly, you swing your legs over the side of the pallet, your bare feet meeting the cold, packed earth floor. There's no plush carpet here, no heated tiles, just the honest, unyielding ground. A shiver traces its way up your spine, a daily reminder that comfort is a luxury few can afford in the high Middle Ages. You reach for your tunic, a simple, undyed linen garment, patched in several places but clean enough. Dressing is a swift, practical affair. No agonizing over what to wear. Your wardrobe isn't exactly bursting with options. The air in your single room is thick with the lingering scent of last night's meager fire wood smoke, a hint of burnt stew, and the ever-present, slightly musty smell of a medieval dwelling. You push open the rough wooden shutters, and the pale, ethereal light of pre-dawn spills into the small space, illuminating floating dust motes like tiny, wandering stars. Outside, the village is slowly stirring. You hear the clank of a pail, the low moo of a cow, the distant rhythmic thud of the baker already kneading his dough. Everyone has their role, their rhythm. The blacksmith will soon be coaxing fire into life. His hammer blows a percussive heartbeat for the community. The farmer will be trudging to his fields, his thoughts on weather and soil. His revolution is the plow. Yours is quieter and significantly sweeter. But your first thoughts are not of bread or iron, nor even of the feudal lord whose land you technically inhabit. Your mind is already with your colonies, nestled in their straw skeps at the edge of your small garden plot, or perhaps in a dedicated apiary a little further from the village bustle, depending on local custom and the size of your operation. You picture them, these intricate, buzzing societies, each a world unto itself. What was the weather like overnight? A sudden frost could be disastrous for any early foragers. Was there a strong wind? A fallen branch could have disturbed a hive. This deep connection to the bees is something that sets you apart. Historians still argue whether the average medieval person truly understood the intricate social structure of a bee colony or simply viewed them as divinely provided, honey-producing automatons. But you, through countless hours of observation, through trial and painful error, because yes, they sting, even you, their devoted keeper. You've gleaned insights that feel like whispered secrets. You might not use terms like pheromones or waggle dance, but you understand the hive's communication, its anxieties, its moments of triumph. You shuffle towards the door, your stomach giving a faint rumble. Breakfast will be simple. A hunk of dark, coarse bread, perhaps a smear of yesterday's honey if you're feeling indulgent, washed down with weak, homebrewed ale or even just water. The medieval diet wasn't famed for its variety, especially for common folk. In fact, a significant portion of the peasant diet revolved around bread and pottage, a kind of thick vegetable stew. That's a mainstream historical fact for you. The daily grind often meant a literal grind of grains. As you unlatch the door, a sliver of the outside world rushes in the smell of damp soil, the crispness of the air, and a stronger, more insistent hum. There's a peculiar little superstition some of the older folk in the village cling to. They say that if a bee is heard buzzing against your window pane before sunrise, it foretells a day of unexpected news. You mostly dismiss such tales, attributing them to overactive imaginations or too much ale the night before, though you do admit a particularly loud hum this early always makes you a little more alert. After all, these are your girls. You step outside, squinting against the growing light. The village path is muddy as usual. You'll need to be careful not to slip and make an ungraceful entrance into your day, much to the amusement of any early rising neighbors. You pull your cloak a little tighter. It's still cold, the kind of chill that settles deep in your bones, a constant companion for much of the year. You take a deep breath. The air, despite the lingering wood smoke, feels cleaner out here, fresher. And through it all, that beautiful, resonant hum. It's more than just the sound of insects. It's the sound of potential, of sweetness, of light in a world that often feels overwhelmingly dark and arduous. It's the sound of your secret life, just beginning to unfold with the dawn. The muddy path squelches a little under your worn leather turn shoes. Simple, single-soled footwear that does more to keep the worst of the muck off your feet than provide any real comfort or support. Think of them as the medieval equivalent of those flimsy hotel slippers, only less hygienic and far more likely to give you an unfortunate encounter with a sharp stone. You head towards your small apiary, a patch of ground a little removed from the main thrum of village life, perhaps nestled against a south-facing wall or at the edge of an orchard if you're lucky enough to have access to one. The bees, you've learned, appreciate a bit of peace and quiet. Much like yourself before your neighbor, Old Man Hemlock starts his daily, tuneless whistling. As you approach, the hum intensifies, a living, breathing cloud of sound that envelopes you. It's a comforting chorus now, but you remember a time when that very sound would have sent a prickle of fear, or at least profound apprehension, skittering down your spine. You weren't born with a veil in one hand and a smoker in the other, after all. Oh no, your entry into the sticky, occasionally painful, but ultimately rewarding profession was, shall we say, less than preordained. It was more of a stumble, a hesitant step into a world you barely knew existed. Perhaps you were a younger son in a family with too many mouths to feed and not enough land to divide. The system of primogeniture, where the eldest son inherited the bulk of the family's property and titles, was a cornerstone of medieval European society. This left younger sons, like yourself perhaps, to find their own way. The church, the army, or a craft. Beekeeping wasn't exactly the most glamorous option on the medieval career fair brochure. No shining armor, no path to lordship, just you, a lot of buzzing insects, and the constant threat of looking like yo. You've had a rather unfortunate allergic reaction. Wanted, brave soul, impervious to pain, fond of honey, willing to work for nature's tiny, winged overlords. Good dental plan not included. That would have been the job posting if such things existed. Or maybe you were simply a curious child, always drawn to the buzzing in the clover fields, the intricate workings of the natural world that others overlooked. You might have spent hours watching wild bees disappear into a hollow log, your nose practically pressed to the bark, wondering about the mysteries within. That initial spark of fascination, that unshakable "what's going on in there?" feeling, can be a powerful motivator, even more so than the threat of future poverty. Your apprenticeship, if you could even call it that, likely began with an older beekeeper in the village, or perhaps a traveling specialist, or even a monk from a nearby monastery. Monasteries, with their need for beeswax for candles, mountains of them. For all those prayers were often at the forefront of beekeeping knowledge. Historians still argue whether formal apprenticeships for beekeeping were common, or if the knowledge was more often passed down informally within families or small communities. It wasn't like becoming a stonemason or a weaver, with clearly defined guild structures in most places. Beekeeping was different, more art than science, more intuition than instruction, at least in these early days of your learning. You remember your first mentor, perhaps a gnarled old man named Thomas, or a surprisingly gentle woman named Agnes, whose hands, despite years of work, moved with a slow, deliberate grace around the hives. They probably seemed like bee whisperers, moving amongst the skeps with a calm that bordered on the magical, while you hovered at a safe distance, convinced each bee had your name on its tiny, invisible hit list. Your first task might have been as simple as grinding herbs for the smoker fuel pungent tansy, or perhaps dried artemisia, or mending broken skep stands. Humiliatingly simple tasks that made you feel less like an apprentice and more like a general dog's body. Go fetch the dung, boy. Not exactly the heroic start you envisioned. And the stings. Oh, the stings. Your first few encounters were likely memorable, not in a good way. Perhaps you flailed, you yelped, you ran. Your mentor would have just shaken their head, a knowing, slightly pitying smile on their lips. They don't like sudden movements, lad/lass, they might have said, after you'd sprinted halfway back to the village, convinced a whole swarm was after your very soul. And they certainly don't appreciate a high-pitched shriek. It offends their delicate sensibilities. You learned quickly that panic was the enemy. You learned to move slowly, deliberately, to project an aura of calm even when your heart was doing a frantic jig against your ribs. It's a bit like trying to defuse a tiny, buzzing bomb that can multiply itself by the thousand. One particularly quirky tidbit you might have picked up early on, or perhaps heard whispered among other aspiring apiarists, was the idea of telling the bees about important events. If there was a death in your family, or a birth, or a marriage, it was considered vital to go to the hives and softly inform them. If you didn't, the belief went the bees might take offense, dwindle, or even leave entirely. Some keepers would even tie a black ribbon to the skep in times of mourning. It sounds utterly bonkers to a modern ear, like trying to update your social media status for a swarm, but in a world where so much was unpredictable and beyond your control, these rituals provided a sense of order, a way of acknowledging the bees as something more than just honey-making machines. They were part of the household, in a strange, buzzing way. You recall the first time you were allowed to truly handle a skep under close supervision, of course. The weight of it, the warmth radiating from within, the sheer intensity of the hum vibrating through your hands. It was both terrifying and exhilarating. Your mentor probably showed you how to use the smoker, a simple clay pot with a nozzle, puffed gently at the hive entrance to calm the bees. The smoke, you learned, masks their alarm pheromones, essentially confusing them and making them more docile, more inclined to gorge on honey in case they need to abandon ship, rather than launch a full-scale attack on the clumsy giant fumbling with their home. It's not a perfect system, as the lingering welts on your arms would testify in those early days. Slowly, painstakingly, you began to absorb the lore, the craft. You learned to read the bees' behavior, the way they flew, the pollen they carried, the sounds they made. You discovered that beekeeping was less about domination and more about cooperation, a delicate dance between your needs and theirs. It was a profession that demanded patience above all else, a virtue not always abundant in youth. There were days of frustration, days when you considered taking up turnip farming instead. Surely, turnips didn't sting. But then there would be a moment, the successful capture of your first swarm, the taste of honey fresh from the comb, the quiet satisfaction of seeing your colonies thrive, and you'd be hooked all over again. It wasn't just a job. It was becoming a part of who you were, this unlikely path into the heart of the hive. And now, as you stand before your own established apiary, the morning sun just beginning to warm the straw of the skeps, you feel a sense of quiet pride. You survived the apprenticeship, stings and all. The sun is a little higher now, chasing away the last of the dawn's chill, and its rays catch the golden straw of your skeps, making them glow softly. These aren't the neat, wooden, multi-story Langstroth hives of a future you can't even imagine. These are the iconic, dome-shaped or cylindrical baskets of the medieval period, the very heart of your apiary. Your first real, independent task, after surviving the initial stings and bewildering instructions of your apprenticeship, was almost certainly learning to construct one of these. It's a fundamental skill, like a baker knowing how to knead dough or a scribe how to trim a quill. Without the skep, there are no managed bees, no honey harvest beyond what you might precariously pilfer from a wild colony in a tree hollow, a risky business that often involved more adrenaline than actual honey. You'd have started with the raw materials. Straw, most commonly rye or wheat, long and unbroken, was the primary ingredient. Sometimes, especially in areas where good straw was scarce, brambles or wicker were used, but straw was generally preferred for its insulative properties, keeping the bees warmer in winter and cooler in summer. You'd gather bundles of it, carefully selected, dried, and cleaned of any stray chaff or broken pieces. Quality matters. A poorly made skep can unravel, offer poor protection, or even injure the bees with sharp, protruding ends. Then comes the binding material, often long, thin strips of bramble, willow, or even split hazel, prepared by soaking them to make them pliable. You'd sit, perhaps in the weak sunshine of late winter or early spring, your hands already calloused from other chores, and begin the rhythmic work. It's a bit like basket weaving, but on a larger, more robust scale. You take a thick coil of straw, your lip, and begin to wind it, layer upon layer, stitching it tightly to the previous layer with your pliable binder. This wasn't done with a needle and thread as we know it. Instead, you'd use a sharpened piece of bone or hardwood, and all to make a hole through the straw coils, then thread the binder through and pull it tight. Over and over, coil and stitch, coil and stitch. It's methodical, almost meditative work, but it requires consistent tension and a good eye to keep the shape uniform. A lopsided skep is an unhappy skep, or at least an inefficient one. Your first attempts were probably a bit wobbly, maybe a bit loose in places, earning a critical squint from your mentor. Tighter, lad/lass. You wanted to hold bees, not just your hopes and dreams, they might have quipped. But with practice, your hands learned the rhythm, the feel of the materials. You learned how thick to make the coils, how tight to pull the binders, how to shape the gentle curve of the dome. Some skeps were quite large, capable of holding a substantial colony and yielding a good amount of honey, while others were smaller, perhaps for housing newer swarms. The average medieval skep was probably around 12 to 18 inches in diameter and a similar height, though sizes varied considerably based on local tradition and the beekeeper's preference. Once the basic structure was complete, you'd leave a small entrance hole, or perhaps a few, near the bottom, not too big, or it would be difficult for the bees to defend against intruders like wasps or robber bees from other colonies. Sometimes, little wooden cross sticks called spleets or stales were inserted horizontally inside the skep, about halfway up. The idea was that these would provide an anchor for the bees to start building their combs. Historians still argue whether these spleets were universally used or if many beekeepers simply let the bees attach their combs directly to the inside of the skep walls. There's evidence for both practices. You might have experimented, finding what worked best for your bees and your local conditions. The final step was often to clume or clome the skep, especially the top and any areas exposed to the worst of the weather. This involved plastering the outside with a mixture of cow dung, clay, and sometimes ash or lime. While this might sound rather earthy to our delicate modern sensibilities, remember that crocodile dung sunscreen we joked about earlier. Medieval folk were nothing if not resourceful with animal byproducts. It served a vital purpose. This coating helped to make the skep waterproof, sealed any small gaps against drafts, and provided extra insulation. Once dried, it formed a hard, protective shell. It wasn't pretty, but it was practical. A freshly clumed apiary probably didn't smell like a rose garden. But then again, neither did most of the medieval world. One quirky, and frankly quite sensible, practice was to place a flat stone or a piece of slate on top of the skep to offer further protection from rain and to help weigh it down against strong winds. Some beekeepers even fashioned little straw or rush hackles or caps, like tiny thatched roofs, to go over their skeps for added weatherproofing. Managing these skeps was a continuous process. You'd arrange them in your apiary, often on low wooden benches or individual stands called stools, to keep them off the damp ground and away from some ground-dwelling pests. You learned to heft them, gently lifting them to gauge their weight, which told you how much honey was stored inside. A light skep in late summer was a worry. A heavy one was a promise of reward. But there was a fundamental, rather brutal aspect to skep beekeeping, especially when it came to the harvest. Because the combs were fixed to the inside of the skep and not easily removable like modern frames, the most common way to get the honey and wax was to sacrifice the colony. The heaviest skeps, full of honey, and the lightest, least likely to survive winter, were often destined for the sulfur pit in autumn. You dig a small hole, place burning sulfur in it, and invert the skep over the fumes. The sulfur dioxide would quickly kill the bees. It was a grim necessity of the system, and even the most hardened beekeeper probably felt a pang of regret. You might have whispered a quiet apology, remembering the old custom of telling the bees. Some beekeepers, particularly those with more skill or perhaps just a gentler heart, practiced driving bees, using smoke and drumming on the skep to encourage the colony to abandon its current home and move into an empty skep placed above or below it, thus saving the bees while still allowing for honey harvest. This was trickier and less common, but showed a growing understanding and perhaps a desire for a less destructive method. You'd also need to be vigilant for signs of swarming, the natural reproductive process of a bee colony. A crowded skep would inevitably lead to a swarm, and losing a prime swarm was like watching your profits fly away on the breeze. So you learned to listen for the distinct change in the hive's hum that often preceded swarming, to look for the construction of queen cells. Sometimes an artificial swarm could be induced, or a skep might be eked, given an extension at the bottom, a ring of straw to provide more space and delay swarming. Your apiary, with its rows of plumed straw domes, might look primitive to a visitor from the future, but to you, it's a place of order, of careful management, of a deep and abiding connection to these incredible creatures. Each skep is a testament to your skill, your patience, and your understanding of a world hidden within straw walls. And as you walk among them now, the morning air filled with their industry, you gently check each entrance, observing the traffic of foragers, your mind already calculating, planning, listening to the whispers of the hive. The sun climbs higher, and the activity around your skeps becomes a vibrant, almost frantic ballet of incoming and outgoing bees. Pollen-laden foragers, their legs dusted yellow, orange, and white like tiny mobile flower arrangements, return with their precious cargo, while others stream out, empty and purposeful, heading for the blooming meadows, the flowering herbs in cottage gardens, or the blossoming trees in the nearby woods. You watch them, fascinated as always, not just by their industry, but by the perceived order and mystery of their internal world. Medieval understanding of bee society was a curious blend of astute observation, wild speculation, and a healthy dose of anthropomorphism. It wasn't zoology as we know it. It was more like a living fable unfolding in your backyard. At the heart of this perceived society was the ruler of the hive. Today, we know this central figure is a queen, the sole reproductive female. But for much of the medieval period, and indeed, dating back to classical writers like Aristotle and Pliny the Elder whose works were revered, the hive leader was believed to be a male, a king bee. It wasn't until the late 16th and early 17th centuries, with figures like Luis Méndez de Torres in Spain and Charles Butler in England, that microscopic observation and careful dissection began to convincingly prove the ruler was, in fact, female. Before that, all the literature, all the lore you'd have been exposed to, if you were literate or lucky enough to hear such texts read, would speak of the king bee. This king bee was imagined as a wise and just monarch, larger than his subjects, diligently overseeing their work, directing their labors, and maintaining discipline within the hive. He was thought to be the only bee without a sting, or if he had one, he never used it, being too noble to engage in such base acts. His subjects were utterly devoted to him, following his commands without question, working tirelessly for the good of the kingdom. If the king bee died, it was believed the colony would fall into chaos and despair, the bees mourning his loss and neglecting their duties. You might have heard tales of bees meticulously constructing a royal tomb for their deceased king, or even committing mass suicide out of grief. It sounds dramatic, but it reflected the hierarchical human societies of the time's kings, lords, peasants, projected onto the natural world. It made a certain kind of sense to the medieval mind. You, as a beekeeper, would have absorbed these ideas. When you saw a particularly large bee in a swarm, or amidst a cluster on a comb, you'd likely assume it was the king. You'd treat him, or rather the idea of him, with a certain reverence. After all, his well-being was synonymous with the well-being of your entire colony. If a hive was failing, perhaps you'd worry that the king was weak or old, or had somehow lost the respect of his subjects. You wouldn't be thinking about egg-laying rates or pheromonal signals. You'd be thinking about royal charisma and a well-ordered insect monarchy. The worker bees, the vast majority of the hive's population, were seen as diligent, loyal subjects, each knowing its place and its duty. They were the builders, the foragers, the guards, the nurses. Their ceaseless activity was a model of industry, often invoked in sermons and moral tales as an example for humans to emulate. Sloth was a deadly sin, after all, and bees were the very antithesis of sloth. You'd observe their tireless comings and goings, the way they meticulously built their combs, hexagon by perfect hexagon, and marvel at their divine programming. Historians still argue whether medieval beekeepers had any inkling of the complex division of labor within the hive based on a bee's age, or if they simply saw it as a homogeneous mass of workers. Your own observations might lead you to notice that some bees seemed to do guard duty more often, while others were consistently hauling pollen, but the underlying mechanisms would remain a profound mystery. And then there were the drones, the larger, stinger-less male bees. Their role was particularly misunderstood. In the king bee narrative, they were often cast as lazy, idle courtiers or disruptive elements within the well-ordered kingdom. They didn't forage, they didn't build, they just seemed to hang around, consuming the colony's precious stores. You'd see them being unceremoniously kicked out of the hive by the worker bees in late summer or autumn, a process that seemed to confirm their uselessness. Good riddance to bad rubbish, you might mutter, watching the workers drag a struggling drone from the entrance. The idea that their sole purpose was to mate with a future, correctly identified queen, and that this act was fatal for them, was far beyond the understanding of the time. They were just the hive's layabouts, the medieval equivalent of a freeloader crashing on the kingdom's couch. One of the most enduring and quirky beliefs about bees was their supposed purity and connection to the divine. Bees were often thought to be chaste, reproducing asexually, or even gathering their young from flowers like dewdrops. This idea of immaculate conception within the hive added to their mystique and made them symbols of virtue and even of the Virgin Mary in Christian iconography. The fact that you, the beekeeper, were privy to the messy, sometimes brutal realities of hive life, the stings, the dead bees, the occasional civil war within a colony if two queens emerged, might have sat a little uneasily with these pristine ideals. But the overarching narrative was powerful. You might also have heard strange tales about how new bee colonies spontaneously generated. While swarming was understood as one method, the ancient theory of bugonia, the idea that bees could be spontaneously generated from the carcass of an ox or cow under specific and rather unpleasant ritualistic conditions, still lingered in some learned texts, a holdover from writers like Virgil. You probably wouldn't be trying to create bees from a dead cow in your backyard. Your neighbors would definitely complain about that, even more than Old Man Hemlock's whistling. But the very existence of such a theory highlights the blend of practical knowledge and fantastical belief that characterized the medieval understanding of the natural world. So, as you peer into the entrance of a skep, or perhaps carefully lift its edge for a fleeting glimpse inside, a risky move without proper protection, you're not just looking at insects. You're looking at a miniature kingdom, a moral allegory, a source of divine wonder. You see the king surrounded by his loyal attendants, the workers toiling ceaselessly, the lazy drones soon to meet their comeuppance. You hear the whispers of their complex society, a language you only partially understand, pieced together from observation, tradition, and the fantastical stories that drift through the medieval air like pollen on the breeze. This hidden world, with its perceived dramas and hierarchies, is as much a part of your beekeeping life as the honey and wax you will eventually harvest. It adds a layer of enchantment to your daily toil, making these tiny creatures more than just livestock. They are a window into a divinely ordered, if slightly misunderstood, universe. The days are lengthening now, warming perceptibly as spring fully unfurls its green banners across the landscape. The hawthorn hedges are frothy with white blossoms, the fruit trees are shedding their petals like fragrant confetti, and the air is alive not just with the hum of your established colonies, but with a particular tension, an expectant energy that every beekeeper learns to recognize. It's swarm season, that time of year when you're well-behaved, home-loving bees get a collective rush of wanderlust to the head and decide to multiply by literally splitting the household. For you, it's a period of high alert, demanding vigilance, quick reflexes, and a certain amount of undignified scrambling. A prime swarm, typically led by the old queen, or, in your medieval understanding, the old king and his most loyal retinue deciding to found a new kingdom, is a valuable commodity. As free bees, a new colony in the making. Losing one to the woods, or worse, to a neighbor who's quicker on their feet, is a significant blow. It's like watching a bag of silver coins sprout wings and fly over the fence. So you're constantly on the lookout for the signs. One of the key indicators is a change in the hive's demeanor. A colony preparing to swarm often becomes a little tetchy. The usual busy hum might take on a louder, more agitated quality. You might notice a reduction in foraging activity in the days leading up to it, as if they're all too busy packing their tiny bee-sized suitcases. If you were brave or skilled enough to peek inside the skep, you'd see the telltale queen cells, larger, peanut-shaped cells where new queens are being raised. The old queen will depart with a portion of the colony just before these new queens emerge, leaving the original hive to a successor. You, of course, are thinking the king is preparing to send out a trusted lieutenant to establish an outpost, or perhaps he himself is leading the pioneering expedition. The actual event of swarming is a sight to behold, a sudden, explosive exodus. One moment, the skep is humming along as usual. The next, a cloud of bees erupts from the entrance, thousands upon thousands of them, swirling into the air in a dizzying, noisy vortex. It's an awe-inspiring, slightly terrifying spectacle. A typical prime swarm can contain anywhere from 10,000 to 20,000 bees, sometimes more. That's a lot of tiny, buzzing bodies to suddenly have airborne in your immediate vicinity. Your heart leaps into your throat. There's no time for leisurely contemplation. It's go time. Your first instinct, honed by experience or frantic instruction from your mentor, is to make a racket. This is one of the most iconic and enduring images of medieval, and even later beekeeping. The pursuit of a swarm accompanied by the banging of pots and pans, the ringing of bells, the clashing of metal objects. This practice, known as tanging or chivalry, was believed to encourage the swarm to settle quickly and, crucially, to stake your claim. Historians still argue whether tanging actually influences the bee's decision to settle, or if it was primarily a way of alerting neighbors that the swarm was yours and they shouldn't try to claim it. The sound might disorient the bees slightly, or it might just be a very effective medieval dibs system. Whatever the precise reason, you'd grab the nearest noisy implement, a metal cooking pot and a ladle, perhaps, and join the cacophony. Your tranquil apiary suddenly sounds like a one-man band having a very bad day, or perhaps a particularly enthusiastic but rhythm-challenged percussion section. The swarm, after its initial aerial explosion, will usually settle in a temporary cluster, often on a nearby tree branch, a fence post, or sometimes, inconveniently, high up in a difficult-to-reach spot. The bees cling together in a dense, pulsating mass around their queen, waiting while scout bees search for a suitable new permanent home. This is your window of opportunity. You need to act before they decide your neighbor's empty wine cask or a hollow in the ancient oak at the edge of the village is their dream real estate. Your swarm-catching kit is simple but essential. You'll have an empty skep, hopefully a light one, perhaps with a little honey or beeswax rubbed inside to make it more inviting. Some beekeepers would even scent it with lemon balm, Melissa officinalis, a plant bees find particularly attractive, its common name, bee balm, is no accident. You'll also need your smoker to calm them if they get agitated, and perhaps a cloth or sheet. If you're lucky, the swarm will have settled on a low, accessible branch. You'll position the empty skep directly underneath the cluster and then give the branch a sharp, decisive shake. With any luck, the majority of the bees, including the queen, will tumble into the skep. A gentle puff of smoke at the top can encourage any stragglers to move downwards. If they start to fan at the entrance of the new skep, it's a good sign. It means the queen is inside, and they're signaling to the others that this is their new home. If the swarm is in a more awkward spot, say high in a tree, your task becomes significantly more athletic and precarious. You might need a ladder, a wobbly, homemade one, of course, or you might have to shimmy up the tree yourself, holding the skep in one hand or having it passed up to you. It's a recipe for scrapes, bruises, and the occasional undignified descent. One quirky, though less common, method for dealing with high swarms was to use a long pole with a hook or a basket attached, trying to gently dislodge or catch the cluster. Imagine trying to play a very high-stakes game of conkers, but with thousands of bees. Once you believe you have the majority of the swarm, and crucially the queen, in your skep, you'll cover it with the cloth and carefully carry it back to your apiary, or to a temporary, cool, dark place for them to settle down before being moved to their permanent stand in the evening. You'll feel an immense sense of satisfaction, and probably a fair bit of relief. You've saved the swarm, expanded your apiary, and prevented a loss of future honey and wax. It's a moment of triumph, often achieved while slightly out of breath, covered in twigs, and possibly with a few new stings as souvenirs despite your best efforts. Your neighbors, hearing the tanging cease, will know you've been successful, perhaps offering a congratulatory nod or a sly comment about you, charming the little beggars. This frantic, exciting ritual of swarm catching is a vital part of your spring. It's a dance with nature's urge to expand, a test of your nerve and agility. Each captured swarm is a victory, a testament to your skill as a beekeeper, ensuring the continuity of your buzzing enterprise and the promise of future harvests. And as you gently place the newly hived swarm in its spot, listening to their contented hum, you can't help but feel a surge of optimism. Spring is truly here, and your world is buzzing with new life. The frantic energy of swarm season begins to subside as spring mellows into the full embrace of summer. The days are long and drenched in golden light, the air thick with the fragrance of 1,000 blooming flowers. Clover carpets the meadows in shades of white and pink. Wild thyme purples the hillsides. Lime trees drip with nectar-rich blossoms, and your cottage garden hums with the scent of lavender, borage, and countless other herbs. This, for you and your bees, is the peak of the year, summer's golden flow, the main honey-making season. It's a time of abundance, but also one that carries its own set of challenges and subtle anxieties. Your bees are working at a fever pitch. From the first blush of dawn until the last rays of sunlight fade, there's a constant, almost overwhelming stream of traffic at the skep entrances. The hum is deeper now, more resonant, filled with the contentment of full bellies and overflowing honeycombs. You watch them, a silent overseer, your mood lifting with the visible evidence of their success. Each returning forager, heavy laden with nectar and pollen, is a tiny deposit into your future bank of sweetness. You might even find yourself idly trying to guess which flowers they've been visiting by the color of the pollen on their legs. Bright orange from dandelions, pale yellow from fruit blossoms, a deep blue from viper's bugloss. It's a small, satisfying game that connects you even more deeply to the landscape around you. You ensure they have access to water, a vital but often overlooked necessity for bees, especially during hot weather. A shallow dish filled with pebbles for them to land on, or a slowly dripping cask near the apiary, can make a big difference. They use water to dilute honey for feeding larvae and to cool the hive through evaporation. A strong colony can collect as much as a liter of water on a hot day. It's one of those small details that separates a thoughtful beekeeper from a merely fortunate one. The sheer abundance of nectar can sometimes present its own problems. If the flow is particularly heavy, the bees might fill the brood area with honey, restricting the queen's, or, in your mind, the king's, ability to lay eggs. This is known as being honey-bound. While it means a lot of honey in the short term, It can weaken the colony in the long run by reducing the number of new bees being raised. Historians still argue whether medieval skep beekeepers had effective methods to manage this, beyond simply hoping for the best or, in some cases, performing a driven swarm to give the queen more space. You might try adding an eek, that straw ring extension at the bottom of the skep. If you suspect this is happening, providing more room for both brood and honey storage, though it's a bit of a blunt instrument. But the sweetness of summer also attracts unwanted attention. Your apiary, a treasure trove of concentrated sugars and protein-rich larvae, is a tempting target for a variety of creatures. Wasps become a particular nuisance, brazenly attempting to enter skeps to steal honey or prey on bees. You might spend time swatting at them or setting simple traps, perhaps a narrow-neck jug containing a little stale ale or sweetened water, easy for them to get into but difficult to escape. Mice, too, can be a problem, especially if they can find a way into the skeps. They'll gnaw combs, steal honey, and generally cause chaos. Keeping the skeps on raised stands helps, as does ensuring the entrances are small enough to deter them. And then there are the larger threats. In some regions, badgers, with their powerful claws and love for grubs and honey, could wreak havoc on an apiary, tearing skeps apart. But the most formidable and, frankly, terrifying predator for a medieval beekeeper was the bear. Brown bears were still relatively common in many parts of medieval Europe, and they possess a legendary fondness for honey and bee larvae. A visit from a bear could mean the utter destruction of your entire apiary. Skeps would be smashed, combs devoured, and your hard work reduced to a sticky, buzzing mess. The thought of it is enough to give you nightmares. You rely on the proximity of the village, the barking of dogs, and perhaps sturdy fences or thorny hedges around your apiary to deter such a catastrophe. Some beekeepers might even resort to setting alarms, perhaps a string with bells that would ring if disturbed. It's a constant, low-level worry in areas where bears roam. Your apiary isn't just a sweet shop. It's a 5-star, all-you-can-eat buffet for Yogi and his medieval ancestors. You also need to be mindful of the weather. A prolonged summer drought can dry up nectar sources, leading to a dearth. Conversely, too much rain can keep the bees confined to their skeps, unable to forage. You become an amateur meteorologist, constantly scanning the skies, sniffing the wind, trying to predict what the heavens might deliver. Your livelihood is inextricably linked to these patterns. Amidst these anxieties, however, there is profound beauty. The sight of a field of red clover alive with your bees, their gentle hum a soundtrack to the summer afternoon, is deeply satisfying. You might take a moment, leaning on a fence post, just to watch them, to feel a part of this incredible natural process. One quirky, and rather lovely, belief found in some medieval texts is that bees were God's special messengers, and their hum was a form of prayer or praise. Listening to your apiary in full summer swing, it's easy to understand why such an idea might take root. It truly does feel like a sacred chorus. As the summer progresses, you begin to heft the skeps more regularly. The increasing weight is a tangible measure of the season's bounty. The straw domes, once light enough to lift with one hand, now require a more careful, two-handed effort. You can almost feel the density of the honey inside, the richness they are storing. This is what it's all about. The long days of toil, the constant vigilance, all leading towards the promise of the harvest. The golden flow isn't just in the fields. It's accumulating, drop by precious drop, within the dark confines of your humble straw skeps. And as the sun sets, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, the hum of the bees softens, a contented sigh at the end of another productive day. You share that contentment, a quiet sense of accomplishment warming you even as the evening air begins to cool. The best and most perilous part is yet to come. While the golden honey is undoubtedly the star of the show, the prize everyone associates with your diligent bees, there's another product of the hive that is, in its own way, almost as valuable and certainly more versatile in medieval society. You wouldn't be dunking this in your tea, mind you, unless you enjoy a particularly waxy brew. We're talking about beeswax. As summer's golden flow continues and you feel the skeps growing heavier, you're not just thinking about the liquid sweetness. You're also keenly aware of the precious, fragrant wax being meticulously crafted within those straw walls. The bees secrete wax from special glands on their abdomens, tiny, almost translucent scales of it, which they then chew and manipulate with their mandibles, mixing it with saliva and other enzymes to construct the perfectly hexagonal cells of their honeycomb. It's an architectural marvel, a feat of engineering that produces the strongest, most efficient structure for its weight. You've marveled at it countless times, the uniformity, the precision, all accomplished in the dark by thousands of tiny builders. It's one of nature's true wonders, and for you, it's also a highly marketable commodity. After the honey was extracted from the combs, a sticky process we'll get to soon, you'd be left with a mass of empty, honey-soaked wax. This wasn't discarded. Oh no, that would be like throwing away silver. The first step was to clean it. This usually involved melting the crushed combs in hot water. The heavier impurities would sink to the bottom, while the lighter beeswax would float to the top. As it cooled, it would solidify into a cake, which could then be lifted off. This process might be repeated several times, each rendering producing a cleaner, purer wax. The smell of melting beeswax, a rich, sweet, slightly floral aroma, would fill your small cottage, a perfume far more pleasant than the usual medieval miasma of wood smoke, unwashed bodies, and dubious sanitation. It's a comforting, wholesome smell that speaks of industry and value. Once you had a good quantity of refined beeswax, its uses were incredibly varied. The most significant and high-demand use for beeswax in the medieval period was for making candles. Tallow candles, made from animal fat, were common enough for everyday use by the peasantry, but they were smelly, smoky, and produced a dim, flickering light. Beeswax candles, by contrast, burned cleanly, brightly, and gave off a pleasant, subtle scent. They were the luxury lighting option, prized by the wealthy nobility and, most importantly, by the church. Churches and monasteries consumed enormous quantities of beeswax candles for their services, illuminating altars, chapels, and scriptoria. A single large cathedral could burn through tons of beeswax in a year. This constant demand made beeswax a reliable source of income for beekeepers. You might sell your rendered wax directly to a local chandler, candlemaker, or perhaps to a monastery which often had its own candlemaking operations. But candles were just the beginning. Beeswax was a key ingredient in various medieval medicines and ointments. Its emollient and protective qualities made it ideal for salves to treat burns, wounds, and skin ailments. Mixed with herbs and other ingredients, it formed the base of many a medieval apothecary's concoctions. You might even keep a little pot of simple beeswax balm for your own chapped hands, a soothing remedy after a day of rough work. Remember how we joked about crocodile dung sunscreen? Well, a beeswax-based balm probably felt like a spa treatment in comparison. It was also crucial for writing and record keeping. Wax tablets were widely used for temporary notes, calculations, and drafting texts before committing them to expensive parchment. These tablets consisted of a shallow wooden frame filled with a layer of darkened beeswax. A stylus, pointed at one end for writing and flat at the other for erasing, by smoothing the wax, was used to inscribe characters. When the notes were no longer needed, the wax could be smoothed over and reused. For a society increasingly reliant on written records, this was an invaluable tool. You probably wouldn't be using these yourself for your shopping list. Remember to get more sulfur for, the bees. But you'd be aware of their use by clerks, merchants, and scholars. Furthermore, beeswax was essential in various crafts. Sculptors and metalworkers used it for the lost wax casting process, cire perdue, to create intricate bronze or other metal objects. A model of the desired object would be made in beeswax, then encased in clay. When the clay was fired, the wax would melt and run out, leaving a hollow mold into which molten metal could be poured. This technique allowed for incredibly detailed and complex metalwork, from church bells to jewelry. The quality of the beeswax was paramount for a successful casting. It was also used as a sealant and polish. Beeswax could be used to waterproof leather, to seal documents with a stamp, creating those iconic wax seals on important letters and decrees, and to give a protective, lustrous finish to wooden furniture or carvings. Archers sometimes used it on their bowstrings to protect them from moisture and wear. Its adhesive properties also made it useful for repairing small items or for holding things in place. Historians still argue about the full extent of its minor household applications, as many such uses would have been too commonplace to record in detail. It was the medieval equivalent of superglue, duct tape, and wood polish, all rolled into one fragrant, natural package. One rather quirky and perhaps slightly less common, used for beeswax, was in cosmetics and personal care, particularly for the wealthy. It could be an ingredient in skin creams, lip balms, or even pomades to style hair. While your average peasant wasn't likely to be indulging in a beeswax facial, for the upper classes, it added a touch of luxury and refinement. So, as you carefully render your beeswax, watching it transform from messy comb to clean, golden cakes, you're handling a substance with far-reaching importance. It's not just a byproduct of honey production. It's a valuable raw material in its own right, woven into the fabric of medieval life in countless ways, from the grandest cathedral ceremonies to the humblest craftsman's bench. The light it provided dispelled darkness. The seals it made secured agreements, and the art it helped create beautified the world. Your bees weren't just making honey. They were producing the very stuff of medieval civilization, one tiny wax scale at a time. And that, you reflect, is a pretty sweet deal. The height of summer begins to wane, the days shortening almost imperceptibly at first, then more noticeably. The frantic nectar flow slows, and a different kind of anticipation builds within you. It's time for the harvest, the culmination of a year's worth of work, worry, and waiting. This is when you finally get to reap the sweet rewards of your bees' labor and your own. But it's also the most perilous part of skep beekeeping, a process fraught with danger, requiring courage, a steady hand, and a profound understanding of your wing charges, because they're not going to give up their hard-earned treasure without a fight. You've been hefting the skeps regularly, as we mentioned, judging their weight. Now, you select the ones destined for harvest. Traditionally, these would be the heaviest skeps, presumed to be brimming with honey, and often the lightest ones, which were deemed too weak to survive the coming winter and whose small stores would be consolidated. This culling was a grim but accepted reality of the skep system. As we touched on before, the most common method of dispatching the colony in these mark skeps was the sulfur pit. You dig a shallow hole, place a small pot or dish containing burning sulfur, brimstone, into it, and then quickly invert the skep over the pit. The rising sulfur dioxide fumes would asphyxiate the bees within minutes. It's a brutal, efficient method. You do this in the evening when all the foragers were home. The silence that fell over the treated skep, once so vibrant with life, would be a stark and perhaps somber moment. No matter how necessary, it's unlikely you ever felt truly good about it. This was the bee-slaying time, as it was sometimes grimly called. Once the bees were dead, or if you were one of the more progressive beekeepers who practiced driving, once the bees had been successfully moved to an empty skep, the real work of extraction began. You'd carry the heavy, silent skep to your cottage or a dedicated outbuilding. The first step was to remove the combs. Since they were fixed to the inner walls of the skep and to each other, this wasn't a neat and tidy affair. You'd use a long, thin knife, perhaps one specifically designed for the purpose, to carefully cut the combs away from the straw. The combs, rich and heavy with honey, sticky and fragrant, would be carefully laid out in clean wooden or earthenware basins. The sheer beauty of a perfect comb, with its tightly packed hexagonal cells, some still capped with pristine white wax, others oozing golden honey, was a sight to behold. It's almost a shame to break it. Almost. Then came the messy part, crushing and straining. You'd take the combs, a mixture of honey, wax, pollen, and sometimes even a few unfortunate bee larvae, extra protein perhaps, and break them up. This could be done by hand, mashing them in the basins, or sometimes with a wooden press if you were fortunate enough to own or have access to one. This would release the honey from the wax cells. The resulting sticky mass was then strained, usually through a coarse cloth like linen or horsehair, or perhaps a specially woven straw skep with an open weave, suspended over a collection pot. The honey would slowly drip through, thick and fragrant, leaving the wax and other debris behind in the cloth. This process could take hours, even days, for all the honey to filter through. The quality of honey was often judged by its clarity and purity, so careful straining was important. The first runnings, often called virgin honey, from uncapped combs, was considered the finest. Your hands, your arms, probably your tunic too, would be covered in sticky honey. Everything would be sticky. It was an occupational hazard. You probably developed a tolerance for being constantly mildly tacky during harvest season. It's a bit like being a human flytrap, only you're after the sweet stuff, not the flies, though you'd probably attract a few of those too. The amount of honey you could expect from a single skep varied enormously, depending on the strength of the colony, the weather during the season, and the availability of forage. A good skep in a good year might yield anywhere from 10 to 40 pounds of honey, though averages were likely lower. This was a significant bounty. Some of it would be kept for your own use throughout the year, a vital source of sweetness in a diet that was often bland. Some would be used for making mead, that beloved medieval beverage. And a good portion would be destined for sale or barter, providing a crucial part of your income. While the sulfur pit method was dominant, as mentioned, some beekeepers did practice driving to save the bees. This involved inverting the honey-laden skep, placing an empty skep mouth to mouth on top of it, and then rhythmically drumming on the sides of the lower skep. The noise and vibration, combined with a little smoke, would encourage the bees to abandon their old home and move upwards into the empty one. Historians still argue how widespread and consistently successful driving was, as it required considerable skill and patience. If successful, it meant you could harvest the honey from the abandoned skep without killing the colony, which could then be reestablished or united with another. It was a more sustainable, though more labor-intensive, approach. You would also, of course, be salvaging every last scrap of that precious beeswax from the leftover combs, as we discussed. After pressing and straining out the honey, the remaining waxy residue would be collected for rendering. Nothing was wasted. The medieval household was, by necessity, a model of thrift. One quirky tidbit related to the harvest is the concept of the angel's share, or perhaps the bee's own share. Some beekeepers, out of respect for their charges or perhaps a touch of superstition, remember telling the bees, might leave a small portion of honey in the hive, especially if they weren't sulfuring the entire colony, or they might offer a small libation of the first pressed honey back to the earth near the apiary as a token of thanks. It was a small gesture acknowledging the bees' immense contribution. Armed for the harvest, you likely wore some form of rudimentary protection. A veil, perhaps made of loosely woven linen or even a fine wicker mesh, would protect your face and neck, the most vulnerable spots. Thick leather gloves, if you could afford them, would protect your hands, though many beekeepers worked barehanded, relying on smoke, speed, and a certain stoic acceptance of the occasional sting. Your clothing would be thick, with sleeves and trousers tied at the wrists and ankles to prevent bees from crawling inside. Despite these precautions, stings were almost inevitable during the harvest, especially if you were dealing with a particularly defensive colony or if things didn't go smoothly. You'd just grit your teeth, pull out the sting, and carry on. It was part of the job description. Must be willing to endure multiple painful injections of bee venom while covered in sticky goo. The harvest was hard, messy, and sometimes painful work, but the reward pots and jars filled with luminous, fragrant honey and cakes of golden beeswax made it all worthwhile. It was the sweet culmination of the beekeeper's year, a tangible return on your investment of time, skill, and bravery. And as you scraped the last of the honey from the straining cloth, your muscles aching but your spirit content, you knew you had secured a little bit of summer's sweetness to see you through the darker, colder months ahead. With the harvest complete, your cottage now holds the sweet, tangible rewards of your labor. Pots of golden honey and cakes of fragrant beeswax. While the beeswax has its myriad important uses, as we've explored, a significant portion of that honey, especially if you've had a bountiful year, is destined for a transformation. A magical alchemy that will turn it from a simple sweetener into the legendary drink of warriors, poets, and kings' mead. Brewing liquid sunshine, as you might poetically, or perhaps after a few cups, slightly tipsily, call it, is another essential skill in your beekeeping repertoire. Mead, or honey wine, is quite possibly one of the oldest alcoholic beverages known to humankind, predating even wine from grapes and beer from grains. Its origins are lost in the mists of antiquity, likely discovered accidentally when some forgotten ancestor tasted naturally fermented honey diluted with water. By the medieval period, it was a well-established and highly prized drink across much of Europe, particularly in northern regions like Scandinavia, Britain, and parts of Germany and Eastern Europe where grapes for winemaking were less abundant. The epic poem Beowulf, an Old English masterpiece, is filled with references to warriors feasting in mead halls, downing horns of this potent brew. It was more than just a drink. It was a symbol of celebration, hospitality, and status. So, how do you, our medieval beekeeper, go about creating this legendary libation? The basic recipe is deceptively simple: honey, water, and yeast. But as with any brewing process, the devil is in the details, and the quality of your ingredients and the care you take will determine whether you end up with a divine nectar or something that tastes vaguely of old socks and regret. First, the honey. The type and quality of honey used would greatly influence the flavor of the mead. Honey from clover might produce a light, delicate mead, while honey from heather could result in a much stronger, more robust flavor, perhaps even with a slightly smoky or medicinal note. You might use your best, cleanest honey for a high-quality batch, or perhaps use some of the darker, stronger flavored honey from later in the season, or even honey pressed from older combs, which might contain more pollen and other impurities that could add complexity or off flavors if you weren't careful. You'd measure out your honey, perhaps into a large earthenware crock or a wooden cask that has been meticulously cleaned. No one wants a batch of mead ruined by lingering flavors of last year's pickled onions. Next, the water. Clean water was essential. You wouldn't want to use water from a stagnant pond or a muddy stream unless you were aiming for a particularly rustic character. Spring water or well water, if available and clean, would be preferred. The ratio of honey to water would determine the strength and sweetness of the final mead. More honey would result in a sweeter, stronger mead, while less honey would produce a drier, lighter beverage. Historians still argue about the typical honey-to-water ratios used in medieval mead making, as recipes were often passed down orally or were very vague in written sources. It was likely a matter of experience and local tradition. You'd know by the feel, the look, perhaps even the taste of the unfermented mixture, called must. Then comes the crucial ingredient, yeast. In the medieval period, brewers didn't have access to commercially cultivated yeast strains in neat little packets. Fermentation was often reliant on wild yeasts present in the air, on the surface of fruits, or in the honey itself, especially if it was raw and unheated. Sometimes, brewers would use the dregs from a previous successful batch of mead or ale, known as barm, to kickstart fermentation. This was a bit of a microbial lottery. You might get a wonderful, vigorous fermentation resulting in a delicious mead, or you might pick up some wild yeasts that produced off flavors or a stuck fermentation. It added an element of delightful uncertainty, or perhaps frustrating unpredictability, to the process. Some recipes called for boiling the honey and water mixture, which would sterilize it but also kill any wild yeasts, meaning you definitely need to add a yeast source. Other methods involved no boiling, relying solely on the natural yeasts. Once the honey and water were mixed and the yeast introduced or hoped for, the container would be covered, perhaps with a cloth to keep out insects but allow gases to escape, and left in a moderately warm place to ferment. This is where the magic, or rather the biology, happens. The yeast consumes the sugars in the honey and converts them into alcohol and carbon dioxide. You'd watch the crock or cask for signs of activity: bubbling, a frothy head, a distinct fermenting aroma. This could take several days to a few weeks for the primary fermentation to complete. After the initial vigorous fermentation subsided, the mead would often be racked, carefully siphoned or poured off the sediment, lees, at the bottom of the container into a clean cask or crock for a period of aging. This aging process was crucial for developing the flavor and clarity of the mead. It could range from a few months for a simple, quickly consumed mead, to a year or even longer for a high-quality brew destined for special occasions. During this time, the flavors would meld and mature, harsh notes would soften, and the mead would gradually clear. Medieval mead makers also frequently added other ingredients to their brews, creating variations known as melomels, mead with fruit, metheglins, mead with herbs and spices, or sicers, mead with apple juice. A particularly quirky, though perhaps not entirely appetizing to modern tastes, addition mentioned in some historical sources is the use of egg whites, which were sometimes added to help clarify the mead. You might experiment with adding local fruits like berries or plums, or herbs from your garden such as meadowsweet, which was a very popular flavoring for mead, rosemary, or thyme. These additions could create wonderfully complex and unique beverages, each batch a reflection of the season and your local environment. The strength of medieval mead could vary widely, from relatively mild, ale-like beverages to potent concoctions that could knock an unsuspecting drinker off their feet. Proper sanitation was, as always in medieval food and drink preparation, a bit hit or miss. A batch could easily become contaminated with bacteria, leading to sour, vinegary results, a heartbreaking outcome after so much effort. But a successful batch? That was cause for celebration. When your mead was finally ready, clear and fragrant, you'd have a supply of liquid gold that could warm the coldest winter night, enliven a village feast, or be offered as a prestigious gift. You might store it in earthenware jugs, leather bottles, jacks, or wooden casks, sharing a horn or cup of your own well-brewed mead with friends and family around a crackling fire, telling stories and sharing laughter. These were the moments that made all the hard work worthwhile. It wasn't just about the alcohol. It was about community, tradition, and the satisfying transformation of simple honey into something truly special. And as you take that first sip of your freshly matured mead, the complex flavors dancing on your tongue, you can't help but feel a connection to generations of mead makers before you, all partaking in this ancient, honeyed magic. Cheers to that, and perhaps try not to spill it on your only good tunic. With your pots of golden honey carefully sealed, your cakes of fragrant beeswax neatly stacked, and perhaps a cask or two of mead quietly maturing in a cool corner, your attention now turns outward, beyond your cottage and apiary, to the bustling, chaotic, and essential heart of medieval commerce, the market. This is where your hard-won produce transforms from personal provision into tangible income, allowing you to acquire the goods and currency needed to sustain yourself and your craft. It's time to go to market, not to buy a fat pig, but to sell the sweet fruits of your bees' labor. The journey to market itself might be a small adventure. Depending on where you live, the nearest significant market town could be a few hours' walk or even a day's travel away. You'd load up your goods, perhaps onto a small handcart if you had one, or carried in baskets slung over your shoulder or balanced on your head. If you were more prosperous, you might have a donkey or a small pony to help with the load. The roads, such as they were, would likely be unpaved, rutted and muddy after rain, dusty in dry weather. You'd travel in the company of others from your village if possible, for safety and companionship. Robbery on lonely stretches of road wasn't unheard of, though a humble beekeeper probably wasn't the prime target for heavily armed bandits. They were more interested in merchants carrying silks or spices. Still, a few sturdy companions made the journey less daunting. The thought of losing your precious honey to a cheeky highwayman after all that work? Unthinkable. You'd probably try to reason with him. Look, mate, it took 50,000 bee hours to make this pot. Have some respect. Arriving at the market town would be an assault on the senses. After the relative peace of your village and apiary, the sheer noise and activity could be overwhelming. The air would be thick with a cacophony of sounds. Merchants hawking their wares, animals bleating and squawking, children shouting, the clang of a blacksmith's hammer from a nearby forge, the rumble of cartwheels on cobblestones, if the town was grand enough to have them. And the smells, a potent medieval potpourri of roasting meat, fresh bread, ripe fruit, not-so-fresh fish, livestock, unwashed bodies, and primitive sanitation. It was vibrant, alive, and probably a bit whiffy. You'd navigate through the throng, looking for a suitable place to set up your modest stall, perhaps in a designated area for local producers. Marketplaces were strictly regulated. Most medieval towns with market rights would have officials, a market reeve or bailiff, who oversaw the proceedings, collected tolls or taxes on goods sold, and ensured fair trading practices, or at least what passed for fair trading. Weights and measures were supposed to be standardized, though variations and occasional sharp practices were common. You might have to pay a small fee for your spot, a stallage, or a pickage if you had to break ground to set up. These regulations, while sometimes irksome, also provided a degree of order and protection. It was in the town's interest to have a thriving, reputable market. You'd lay out your wares as attractively as possible. Your honey, perhaps in small earthenware pots or poured directly into a buyer's own container, its golden translucence catching the light. Your cakes of beeswax, clean and fragrant, would be neatly displayed. If you had mead ready, you might offer small samples to entice buyers, though selling alcoholic beverages often had its own specific rules and licensing depending on the locale. You'd call out to passers-by, extolling the virtues of your honey: finest clover honey, fresh from the comb, sweetness from God's own little messengers, or the purity of your beeswax. Best beeswax for your candles, Syrah. Burns bright and clean. You weren't just a beekeeper now, you were a salesperson, a negotiator, a small-time entrepreneur. Your customers would be a varied lot. Local townsfolk looking for a sweetener for their food, as sugar was still an expensive imported luxury for most. Bakers might buy honey for making sweet cakes or spiced bread. Wealthier households might purchase larger quantities of honey and beeswax for their kitchens and chapels. Chandlers, the professional candle makers, would be keen buyers of good quality beeswax. Monasteries, if they didn't have their own sufficient apiaries, would also purchase beeswax for their prodigious candle consumption. Historians still argue about the extent to which individual beekeepers directly supplied large institutions versus selling to intermediary merchants. It likely varied depending on your location and the scale of your operation. Bartering was still common, especially for smaller transactions. You might trade a pot of honey for a length of cloth from a weaver, some iron tools from a blacksmith, or perhaps some salt, a vital and often expensive commodity. "I'll trade you this pot of sunshine for that rather fetching chicken." Might be a perfectly reasonable negotiation. For larger sales or in more established markets, coinage would be used. The currency system was complex, with various denominations of silver pennies, groats, and shillings, and the actual value could fluctuate. You'd need to be sharp to ensure you got a fair price. You'd observe the other sellers, the farmers with their produce, the artisans with their crafts. The market was a microcosm of the medieval economy, a place of exchange, competition, and community. You might catch up on news and gossip from other villages, hear tales from traveling merchants, or even witness a public proclamation or a wandering minstrel. It was more than just a place to trade. It was a social event, a vital link to the wider world beyond your immediate locality. One quirky aspect of medieval markets was the presence of hucksters or regraders, small-scale traders who would buy goods from producers like yourself and then resell them at a higher price within the same market, or take them to sell elsewhere. This practice was often viewed with suspicion and sometimes legally restricted, as it was seen as profiting without adding real value, but it was a common feature of the market landscape. You might sell some of your honey to a huckster if you needed a quick sale and didn't want to spend all day at the stall. By the end of the market day, hopefully your baskets would be lighter and your purse or pouch a little heavier with coins, or you'd have a collection of bartered goods. You'd pack up your remaining wares, tired but hopefully satisfied. The journey home would feel different, a sense of accomplishment mingling with the fatigue. The coins you earned would go towards paying your rent or dues to the local lord, buying necessities you couldn't produce yourself, like salt, iron, or perhaps a new pair of shoes if you were feeling flush, or investing back into your beekeeping, perhaps buying new straw for skeps or a better knife for harvesting. The market was your connection to the cash economy, a vital outlet for the fruits of your specialized labor. It was where the secret life of the medieval beekeeper intersected with the broader currents of medieval society, turning golden honey and fragrant wax into the means of survival and, perhaps, a little bit of comfort. And as you trudge home, the sounds of the market fading behind you, you're already thinking about your bees and the next season and the next journey to that bustling, chaotic, wonderfully essential place. The vibrant, bustling energy of the market and the sweet rewards of the harvest begin to fade into memory as autumn deepens, its fiery colors giving way to the stark, skeletal beauty of late fall. A chill permeates the air, no longer the crisp refreshment of spring or the gentle coolness of a summer evening, but a damp, penetrating cold that speaks of the harshness to come. For you, the medieval beekeeper, this signals a crucial and anxious period. Preparing your precious colonies for winter's icy grip. Survival is not guaranteed, neither for you nor for your bees. This is when your husbandry skills are truly tested. Your primary concern is ensuring your bees have enough food stores to last them through the long, cold months when there will be no nectar or pollen to be found. After the main honey harvest, you would have carefully assessed the remaining skeps. Those colonies you decided to overwinter needed to be heavy with honey. A strong, healthy colony would need a significant amount of honey, perhaps 20 to 30 pounds or even more, depending on the length and severity of the winter and the size of the colony, to survive until spring. If a skep felt too light, you might have to make a difficult decision. Sometimes, weaker colonies were united with stronger ones by driving the bees from the weaker skep into the stronger one, hoping their combined strength and stores would see them through. This was a delicate operation, as bees from different colonies don't naturally take kindly to sudden housemates, but sometimes it was the only option to save at least some of them. All right, lads, time for a medieval bee merger. Try not to kill each other in the boardroom, okay? You'd also want to ensure the colonies being overwintered were strong in numbers and, ideally, had a healthy, fertile queen or king, as you still perceive it. A small, dwindling colony, even with adequate stores, would struggle to generate enough heat to survive the deep cold. You'd have made these assessments back when you were selecting skeps for the sulfur pit, always aiming to keep your best and strongest for the next season. The physical protection of the skeps themselves was paramount. Remember that cluming process, plastering the skeps with cow dung and clay? This layer provided excellent insulation, but you might add even more protection now. You'd ensure the clume was intact, patching any cracks that might have appeared. Some beekeepers would wrap their skeps in extra layers of straw or bracken, like bundling up a child against the cold. One common practice was to place the skeps in a sheltered location, perhaps grouping them together on the south side of a wall or building, or even partially burying them in a trench or bank of earth, covered with a layer of straw or turf. This provided protection from biting winds and helped to maintain a more stable, though still cold, temperature inside the skep. This practice was sometimes called winter clamping. Adequate ventilation was also, somewhat counterintuitively, important. While you wanted to keep the cold out, a completely sealed skep could lead to problems with condensation. The bees' own respiration and the moisture from their stores would create a damp environment, which could lead to moldy combs and chilled bees. Historians still argue about the precise methods medieval beekeepers used to balance insulation and ventilation in their skeps. Perhaps a small ventilation hole near the top of the skep, protected from direct rain or snow, was maintained. Some beekeepers might have placed a layer of porous material, like moss or rough cloth, under the skep's cap to absorb excess moisture. You'd also take measures to protect your apiary from winter predators. Hungry mice, desperate for food and shelter, could be a major problem, gnawing their way into skeps and destroying combs. You'd make sure the skep entrances were reduced to the smallest possible size, just large enough for a bee or two to pass, to make it harder for mice to get in. Perhaps you'd set traps around the apiary. Woodpeckers, too, could be a nuisance in some areas, pecking holes in the straw skeps to get at the bees or larvae within. You might try to scare them off with makeshift deterrents, though a determined woodpecker is a persistent foe. One quirky but sensible practice you might employ is ensuring the skeps are slightly tilted forward. This allows any moisture that does condense inside, or any rain that might seep in, to drain out through the entrance rather than pooling at the bottom and chilling the cluster of bees. It's a small detail, but in the fight for winter survival, every little bit helped. Once your bees were settled into their winter quarters, there wasn't much more you could do for them directly. Unlike modern beekeepers who can open hives on mild winter days to check stores or provide emergency feeding, you couldn't really peek inside your straw skeps without causing major disturbance and heat loss. You had to trust that you'd prepared them well. It was a period of anxious waiting. On particularly cold, stormy nights, you might lie in your own chilly cottage, listening to the wind howl and worry about your bees. Were they warm enough? Did they have enough food? It's that feeling of helplessness, knowing their fate is largely out of your hands now, sealed away in their straw fortresses. You might, on a milder, sunny winter day, see a few bees take a brief cleansing flight to void waste. This would be a reassuring sign that the colony was still alive. But mostly, the apiary would be silent, the skeps looking like small, snow-dusted mounds if winter was harsh. The vibrant hum of summer would be a distant memory. Providing winter food, if stores were desperately low, was extremely difficult with traditional skeps. Some sources mention attempts at candy feeding, placing a cake of hardened honey or sugar, if available and affordable, over a hole in the top of the skep, but this was risky and not always effective. Mostly, you relied on the honey they had stored themselves. This is why the autumn assessment was so critical. You were essentially gambling on their stored resources versus the unknown length and severity of the coming winter. The winter months were a lean time for you as well. Your own food stores would be dwindling. The days were short, the nights long and cold. But the thought of your bees, clustered tightly together inside their skeps, generating their own warmth, a tiny spark of life in the frozen landscape, would be a quiet comfort. Their survival meant your survival, your livelihood for the coming year. And as you huddled by your own meager fire, you dream of spring, of the first crocuses, and the returning hum that would signal that you and your remarkable bees had made it through winter's icy grip once more. It was a testament to their incredible resilience and to your careful, if somewhat anxious, stewardship. As you navigate the anxieties of winter, with your bees tucked away in their straw fortresses, you're not just relying on practical measures like insulation and food stores. In the medieval world, where so much was unpredictable and seemingly at the mercy of unseen forces, people often turned to other means of protection and reassurance. Charms, chants, and a rich tapestry of folk magic. Your secret life as a beekeeper is deeply interwoven with this world of superstition and bee lore, a fascinating blend of Christian belief, pagan remnants, and hard-earned practical wisdom passed down through generations. You've already encountered the custom of telling the bees about significant family events, deaths, births, marriages. This wasn't just a quaint tradition. It was often seen as vital for the continued prosperity of the hives. To neglect this duty was to risk offending the bees, potentially causing them to dwindle, abscond, or stop producing honey. Some beekeepers would even drape the skeps with black cloth during a period of mourning in the household, or tie a piece of colorful ribbon to celebrate a wedding. It was about including the bees in the human sphere, acknowledging their almost familial role. Then there were the specific charms and incantations used to protect the bees from harm or to encourage their productivity. These might be recited when hiving a new swarm, during the honey harvest, or when the bees seemed unwell. Many of these charms blended Christian prayers with older, possibly pagan, elements. For example, a charm to prevent bees from straying or being stolen might involve making the sign of the cross over the skeps while reciting a specific verse from the Bible, followed by an older, less overtly religious incantation invoking the power of certain plants or natural elements. It was a spiritual belt and braces approach. Cover all your bases, divine and a little bit magical. You might have a particular set of words you whisper when a swarm takes to the air, something passed down from your mentor, believed to help them settle quickly and nearby. Or perhaps there's a chant you use when you're about to take honey, asking the bees permission and promising to leave them enough to survive. These weren't necessarily seen as contradicting Christian faith. Rather, they were often viewed as tapping into the God-given properties and hidden virtues of the natural world. After all, if God created bees, He surely created ways to communicate with them and influence their behavior for good. Historians still argue about the precise origins and interpretations of many of these bee-related folk practices, as they were often transmitted orally and varied greatly by region. Some scholars see them as direct continuations of pre-Christian beliefs, while others emphasize their integration within a broader medieval Christian worldview. The lines were often blurry. Herbs played a significant role in this bee lore. We've mentioned lemon balm, Melissa officinalis, for attracting swarms. Other plants were believed to have protective qualities for bees. You might plant rue or hyssop near your apiary, not just for their culinary or medicinal uses, but because they were thought to ward off evil influences or bee diseases. A particularly quirky belief was that planting fennel near hives would make the bees fierce and bad-tempered, while borage would make them happy and productive. So, you be careful with your companion planting, creating a botanical force field of good vibes around your skeps. Sorry, bees, no angry fennel for you today, only happy borage. There were also superstitions surrounding the buying and selling of bees. It was sometimes considered unlucky to sell bees for coin. Instead, they should be bartered for goods of equivalent value or given as a gift with a symbolic return payment, like a single coin, immediately handed back. If bees were stolen, it was believed they would not thrive for the thief. Honesty, it seemed, was the best policy even in bee commerce, backed up by a bit of supernatural threat. Omens and portents were also closely observed. A swarm landing on a dead branch was considered a bad omen, perhaps foretelling a death in the family or a poor harvest. Conversely, if a swarm settled on your roof, it might be seen as a sign of good fortune to come. The behavior of the bees could also be read for signs. If they were unusually agitated for no apparent reason, it might mean bad weather was approaching, or perhaps even some unseen spiritual disturbance. You became attuned to these subtle cues, a reader of bee moods and their supposed connections to the wider world. Even the sound of the bees carried meaning. A loud, contented hum was, of course, a good sign. But if the humming was low and mournful, or if a hive fell silent unexpectedly, it was cause for great concern, not just practically but perhaps spiritually too. Some lore suggested that bees would hum a special song on Christmas Eve, or that they would turn in their hives to face east at the moment of Christ's birth. These beliefs elevated the bees beyond mere insects, imbuing them with a kind of sacred awareness. You might also have small, personal rituals. Perhaps you always approached your hives from a certain direction or wore a particular and hopefully cleanish garment when working with them, believing it brought good luck. These little routines, while perhaps not magic in the dramatic sense, provided a sense of control and comfort in a profession that was often at the mercy of unpredictable nature. This undercurrent of lore and superstition didn't replace your practical knowledge of beekeeping. You still needed to know how to build a skep, manage a swarm, and harvest honey. But it added another layer of understanding, another set of tools, however intangible, to help you navigate your world. It provided explanations for the inexplicable, comfort in times of anxiety, and a deeper sense of connection to your bees and the traditions of your craft. In a world lit by fire and ruled by seasons, where the veil between the mundane and the magical often seemed very thin, these charms, chants, and bits of bee lore were an integral part of your secret life. As real and as important as the smoke from your smoker or the straw of your skeps. They were the whispers of ancient wisdom echoing in the hum of your hives. Beyond the practicalities of honey production and the folk magic that often surrounded your craft, there was another significant dimension to your life as a medieval beekeeper, your relationship with the church. In a society where Christianity was the dominant spiritual and often temporal power, even the humble bee and its keeper were woven into a complex tapestry of religious symbolism, economic obligation, and divine contemplation. Your bees weren't just buzzing insects, they were potent symbols, and their products were vital for the very practice of faith. We've already touched upon the enormous demand for beeswax for candles within churches and monasteries. The pure, bright flame of a beeswax candle was seen as symbolic of Christ, the light of the world, and its clean burn and pleasant scent were considered more fitting for sacred rituals than smoky, smelly tallow. From the grandest cathedrals with their forests of candles illuminating high altars to the smallest parish church needing a few candles for daily mass, the consumption was immense. This created a constant, reliable market for your beeswax, making the church one of your most important indirect customers, even if you sold your wax to a merchant or chandler who then supplied religious institutions. Monasteries themselves were often significant centers of beekeeping. Monks, particularly in orders like the Benedictines who valued manual labor and self-sufficiency, ora et labora, pray and work, frequently maintained their own apiaries. They had the land, the resources, and often the scholarly inclination to study and improve beekeeping techniques. Many of the surviving medieval texts on beekeeping were written by monks or clergy who saw the study of God's creation, including bees, as a form of devotion. These monastic apiaries not only supplied beeswax for their own chapel and scriptorium, where beeswax was also used for wax tablets and sealing documents, but also honey for their table and for making mead, which often supplemented their diet or was offered to guests. You might have learned some of your craft from a monk, or perhaps you occasionally traded your surplus honey or wax with a nearby religious house. The bees themselves were imbued with rich Christian symbolism. Their highly organized society, seemingly ruled by a single leader, the king bee, as it was then understood, was seen as a mirror of a divinely ordered universe with God at its head, and also as a model for a well-governed Christian kingdom or community. The tireless industry of the worker bees was lauded as an example of virtuous labor, a stark contrast to the sin of sloth. Saint Ambrose, one of the early church fathers, wrote extensively about bees, praising their diligence, their chastity, as they were believed to reproduce asexually, remember, and their selfless devotion to the common good of the hive. These interpretations were frequently echoed in sermons and religious writings, making the bee a familiar and positive symbol for the medieval populace. Honey, too, carried spiritual significance. It was often associated with the Promised Land, described in the Old Testament as a land flowing with milk and honey, symbolizing abundance, sweetness, and divine blessing. Christ's words were sometimes described as being sweeter than honey. Honey was used in some liturgical contexts, and its natural purity and sweetness made it a fitting symbol for spiritual nourishment and the goodness of God's creation. This close association with the church also meant that beekeeping and its products became subject to tithes. The tithe was a religious tax, typically 1/10 of a person's produce or income paid to support the local church and clergy. While tithes were most commonly levied on agricultural produce like grain and livestock, in many areas, honey and beeswax were also tithable commodities. This meant that a portion of your hard-won harvest, perhaps 1 pot of honey out of every 10, or a certain weight of beeswax, would be due to the parish priest or the ecclesiastical institution that held the tithing rights for your area. Historians still argue about the consistency and strictness with which tithes on bee products were collected across different regions and time periods. It could vary greatly. For you, the beekeeper, this was simply another of life's obligations, like paying rent to your secular lord. You'd set aside the church's share, perhaps with a grumble if the harvest had been poor, but generally accepting it as part of the established order. The blessing of bees and apiaries was also a known practice. A priest might be called upon to perform a ritual blessing over your skeps, particularly at the beginning of the season or if the bees seem to be ailing. These blessings would invoke God's protection over the bees, asking for them to be fruitful, to be safe from harm, from storms, disease, or even witchcraft, and to produce an abundance of honey and wax. This ritual act reinforced the idea that beekeeping was a licit and even divinely favored occupation, placing your endeavors under the umbrella of God's grace. One quirky charm-like prayer for bees, found in some medieval manuscripts, asks for the bees to be as numerous as the stars in heaven or the sands of the sea, a clear echo of biblical promises of abundance. Sometimes conflicts could arise. For instance, if your bees swarmed and settled on church land or even inside the church itself, which must have made for some very interesting services, there might be disputes over ownership of the swarm. Church law and local custom would dictate how such situations were resolved. Your personal faith, like that of most medieval people, would likely be a sincere and integral part of your life. You might offer a silent prayer for the safety of your bees as you tended them, or give thanks for a bountiful harvest. The natural wonder of the hive, the incredible industry of these tiny creatures, and the sweetness they produced could easily be seen as direct evidence of God's benevolent design. Your work, in a small way, felt connected to this divine order, providing not just sustenance for the body, but also materials that aided the worship and glory of God. This connection, whether through the candles that lit the altar or the symbolism that enriched a sermon, gave your humble craft a significance that resonated far beyond your small apiary, linking your secret life to the overarching spiritual narrative of the age. As you go about your daily, seasonal tasks, coaxing swarms, harvesting honey, preparing for winter, you're not doing so with your bare hands alone, unless you're feeling particularly brave or have developed an almost supernatural immunity to stings, which, let's be honest, is unlikely. The medieval beekeeper, while not possessing the sophisticated, specialized equipment of their modern counterparts, still relied on a small arsenal of primitive but effective tools and protective gear, often fashioned from readily available materials. These were the humble extensions of your own skill and courage, allowing you to interact with your thousands of tiny, sometimes tetchy, charges with a slightly reduced chance of ending up looking like a swollen pincushion. The most iconic and arguably most important tool in your kit was the smoker. We've touched on it before, but its significance can't be overstated. The medieval smoker wasn't the gleaming stainless steel bellows-operated device you might picture today. It was typically a much simpler affair, a small earthenware pot or censer, often with a lid and a nozzle or spout, sometimes with a handle. Into this pot, you'd place your smoldering fuel. This wasn't specialized with pellets, you'd use whatever was locally available and known to produce a cool, calming smoke. Dried, rotten wood punkwood was a common choice, as were dried herbs like tansy, yarrow, or artemisia, which were believed to have properties that pacified bees. Some beekeepers even used dried cow dung, a surprisingly effective and slow-burning fuel if you could get past the initial ick factor. Remember, medieval folk were champions of recycling, especially when it came to dung. To operate it, you'd light the fuel until it was smoldering well, then gently blow through the nozzle or wave the pot to direct puffs of smoke towards the hive entrance or over the combs when you were working the skep. The smoke, as we know, masks the bees' alarm pheromones, reducing their defensive behavior and encouraging them to gorge on honey, making them more docile. It wasn't foolproof. A really angry colony could sometimes power through a cloud of smoke with determined fury, but it was your first and best line of defense. Keeping the smoker going and producing the right kind of cool, dense smoke was a skill in itself. Too much heat and you'd anger them more, too little smoke and it would be ineffective. For personal protection, the primary item was a veil. This wasn't a fancy zippered bee suit. The medieval beekeeper's veil was typically a simple affair made from loosely woven cloth, like linen or even fine canvas, or sometimes a cylinder of fine wickerwork or horsehair mesh. It would be designed to cover your head and face, draping down over your shoulders, and might be secured with a drawstring around the neck or tucked into the collar of your tunic. The aim was to keep the bees away from your sensitive face and eyes. Visibility through these primitive veils wasn't always great, and they could be hot and stuffy, but it was a far better alternative than taking a sting to the eyeball. Fashion forward? Not so much. Functional against 1,000 tiny lances? Absolutely. Gloves were less common, or at least less consistently depicted in medieval illustrations of beekeeping. Many beekeepers likely worked barehanded, relying on smoke, quick movements, and a long-suffering tolerance for stings. If gloves were used, they would have been made of thick leather, similar to a workman's gauntlet. While offering good protection, they would also reduce dexterity, making delicate tasks like handling combs or capturing a queen more difficult. Historians still argue about the prevalence of glove use, as direct evidence is sparse and artistic depictions can be unreliable for such details. You might have owned a pair for particularly aggressive colonies or during heavy harvesting, but perhaps preferred the sensitivity of bare hands for more routine inspections. Your general clothing also served as a form of protection. You'd wear a long-sleeved tunic, probably made of coarse wool or thick linen, and trousers or leggings. The key was to have no gaps where bees could crawl in. Cuffs would be tied at the wrists and trousers tucked into boots or tied at the ankles. A wide-brimmed hat might be worn under the veil to help keep it away from your face. Light-colored clothing was sometimes preferred based on the observation accurate, as it turns out that bees tend to be less aggressive towards lighter colors than darker ones. For harvesting honey from the skeps, a long, thin knife was essential. This honey knife would be used to cut the combs away from the inside of the skep. It needed to be sharp enough to slice through wax and comb attachments cleanly and long enough to reach deep inside the skep. It might have a slightly curved blade to better follow the contours of the dome. This was a specialized tool, perhaps made by the local blacksmith to your specifications or passed down from your mentor. You'd also need various containers, earthenware pots, wooden buckets, or basins for collecting the honey and combs. For straining the honey, as we discussed, you'd use cloths of linen or horsehair, or perhaps a specially woven straw basket that acted as a sieve. These were everyday household items, repurposed for the sticky business of the harvest. When it came to constructing and maintaining skeps, you'd use an awl, a pointed tool made of bone, hardwood, or iron, for making holes in the straw coils to pass the binding material through. A good sharp knife would be needed for trimming straw and preparing the bramble or willow binders. For swarm catching, beyond the empty skep and your smoker, you might have a long pole with a hook or a small basket attached, especially for swarms that settled high up. Remember the tanging equipment? Pots, pans, ladles, anything that could make a loud, claim-staking racket. While perhaps not tools in the strictest sense, they were certainly part of the swarm-catching toolkit. One quirky and rather ingenious tool mentioned in some older beekeeping texts is the bee bob or swarm catcher on a pole. This might be a small bunch of attractive herbs like lemon balm or even a piece of old comb tied to the end of a long stick. The idea was to present this to a flying swarm to encourage them to settle on it, making them easier to collect. Think of it as a medieval bee lure on a stick. These tools were simple, often homemade or locally sourced, and a far cry from the specialized equipment of modern apiculture. There were no centrifugal extractors, no queen excluders, no hive tools with multiple functions. Yet, with this rudimentary kit, medieval beekeepers managed complex colonies, harvested valuable products, and sustained a craft that was vital to their communities. Your tools weren't just objects, they were an extension of your knowledge, your hands, and your courage, enabling you to engage with the powerful, sometimes perilous, world of the hive. Each scrape on your smoker, each patch on your veil, told a story of your secret life among the bees. Your life as a medieval beekeeper, intertwined as it is with the rhythms of nature and the sweet rewards of the hive, is not without its persistent anxieties. Beyond the grand threats of winter starvation or a marauding bear, there's a host of smaller, often insidious, enemies that constantly seek to undermine the health and productivity of your precious colonies. The tiny terrors and hive woes that can turn a thriving skep into a desolate ruin. Dealing with these pests and diseases with your limited medieval understanding and resources is a constant battle of observation, prevention, and sometimes desperate intervention. One of the most visible and frustrating pests would be wax moths. There are two main species, the greater wax moth, Galleria melanella, and the lesser wax moth, Acroia gracella, and both are a nightmare for beekeepers. The adult moths themselves don't do direct harm, but they lay their eggs in cracks and crevices in the skep or even directly on the combs if they can gain access. It's their larvae that are the real problem. These voracious grubs tunnel through the beeswax combs, devouring wax, pollen, honey, and even bee pupae. They leave behind a mess of silken webs, frass, their droppings, and destroyed comb. A heavy infestation can quickly overwhelm a weak colony, leaving it a tangled, ruined mess, and can even cause a strong colony to abscond. The smell of a heavily wax moth-infested hive is distinct and unpleasant, a sort of musty, decaying odor. You'd be constantly vigilant for signs of wax moth, webs on the combs, tunnels, or the site of the pale, wriggling larvae themselves. Your best defense was to maintain strong, populous colonies as they were better able to police their combs and remove young moth larvae. Keeping your apiary clean, removing any discarded bits of comb or debris where moths might lay eggs, was also important. If you found a skep lightly infested, you might try to manually remove the affected combs if possible, though this was very difficult in a fixed comb skep, or hope the bees could deal with it. For heavily infested combs taken during harvest or from a colony that died out, you might try to salvage the wax by melting it down quickly, which would kill the larvae, but the honey would likely be foul. Historians still argue about the specific methods medieval beekeepers might have used to control wax moths beyond good hive hygiene in strong colonies. Some herbal deterrents might have been tried, but their efficacy is unproven. It was a persistent, gnawing problem. Ants could also be a nuisance, particularly in warmer weather. They are drawn to the sweet honey and would invade skeps if they could find an easy route. While a strong colony could usually repel small numbers of ants, a persistent invasion could be stressful for the bees and lead to losses of honey. You try to keep the skep stands clear of vegetation that might form a bridge for ants, and some beekeepers would place the legs of their hive stands in dishes of water or coat them with sticky substances like tar, if available, to create a barrier. It's like building a tiny moat around your bee castles. Mice, as mentioned in the context of winter preparations, were a year-round threat if they could gain access. They seek shelter and food, and a warm, dry skep full of honey and pollen is an ideal mouse hotel. They chew combs, steal honey, foul the hive with their droppings and urine, and their presence can cause the bees to abscond or die from stress and cold, as the damaged combs reduce the colony's ability to cluster effectively. Keeping entrances small and skeps on raised, clear stands was your main defense. You might also have a good Mauser cat patrolling the apiary, a low-tech but often effective pest control solution. Mittens, the fierce guardian of the honey, defender against the whisker-twitching hordes. Then there were the diseases, far more mysterious and terrifying because their causes were completely unknown in the medieval period. You'd only see the symptoms: dwindling populations, dead larvae, unusual bee behavior. What you would have known as foul brood, though you wouldn't have used that specific term, nor distinguished between American foul brood and European foul brood, would have been a devastating sight. Larvae would die in their cells, turning brown and decomposing into a ropey, foul-smelling mass. The only real cure for a badly infected colony was to destroy it completely, bees, combs, skep and all, usually by burning, to prevent the highly contagious disease from spreading to other colonies. This was a heartbreaking decision, like watching your investment go up in smoke. Literally. The cause, a bacterium, was far beyond medieval comprehension. It would have been attributed to bad air, an imbalance of humors in the bees, or even witchcraft. Other ailments might include dysentery, often noticeable in late winter or early spring, where bees would soil the combs and the front of the skep with fecal spotting. This was usually linked to poor quality winter stores, like unripened honey or honey high in solids like honeydew, or prolonged confinement due to bad weather. There wasn't much you could do beyond hoping for better weather and ensuring good quality stores in the autumn. One particularly quirky and somewhat tragic misunderstanding was the condition known as Isle of Wight disease, though this name came much later, early 20th century. However, similar symptoms of adult bees crawling, unable to fly, with distended abdomens would have been observed in medieval times. This was eventually identified as being caused by the tracheal mite, Acarapis woodi, and associated viruses. To a medieval beekeeper, seeing their adult bees suddenly unable to fly, crawling pathetically on the ground, would have been deeply alarming and utterly baffling. Again, the cause would be a mystery, perhaps attributed to poisoning from certain plants or some malevolent influence. You'd rely on keen observation to spot the early signs of trouble. A change in the bee's behavior, a strange smell from the skep, an unusual number of dead bees at the entrance. These were all red flags. Your remedies were limited. Sometimes moving a struggling colony to a new, clean skep and a different location was tried in the hope that a change of scenery might help. Herbal concoctions might be fed to the bees or burned in the smoker based on traditional plant lore, but their effectiveness was dubious at best against serious pathogens. The fight against these tiny terrors and insidious diseases was a constant, often frustrating, part of your beekeeping life. It required resilience, a willingness to make hard choices, and a deep well of patience. Each healthy, thriving colony was a small victory against a host of unseen enemies, a testament to your vigilance and the incredible natural resilience of the bees themselves. And when you did lose a colony, despite your best efforts, it was a stark reminder of the fragility of life and the ever-present challenges of working so closely with the natural world. Your life as a medieval beekeeper isn't just about the practicalities of managing hives or the mystical lore surrounding your charges. It's also, surprisingly perhaps, touched by the long arm of the law. Bees, despite their wild nature, occupied a unique and somewhat ambiguous space in medieval legal systems. They weren't quite domesticated livestock in the same way as a cow or a sheep, yet they weren't entirely wild creatures either, especially when hived and managed by a beekeeper. This led to a fascinating and sometimes perplexing set of laws and customs surrounding their ownership, their behavior, and the rights and responsibilities of their keepers. Understanding these laws of the swarm was crucial if you wanted to protect your investment and avoid disputes with your neighbors. The most significant legal issue usually revolved around swarms. As we've discussed, swarming is the natural way bee colonies reproduce, and a prime swarm is a valuable asset. But what happened if your prize swarm, the one you'd been eagerly anticipating, decided to fly off your land and settle on your neighbor Goodman Giles's prize-winning apple tree? Who owned it then? This was a common point of contention, and various legal traditions sought to address it. A fundamental principle in many medieval legal codes, derived in part from Roman law, specifically the writings of Gaius, was that bees were considered fieri naturae, wild by nature. This meant that, in their natural state, they belonged to no one. However, once you hived them and they were under your control, they became your property. The critical point was possession. If they swarmed and left your property, your ownership could become tenuous. The general rule that emerged in many areas was that you retained ownership of a swarm as long as you kept it in sight and were actively pursuing it. This is where that practice of tanging banging pots and pans became legally significant. It wasn't just to encourage the bees to settle, it was a public declaration. These are my bees. I am following them. Don't even think about claiming them, Hemlock. If you gave up the pursuit, or if the swarm flew out of your sight and settled, then, in many legal interpretations, it reverted to its wild state, and the person on whose land it settled could claim it by hiving it themselves. This created a strong incentive for quick action and noisy pursuit. Imagine the frantic, clanging chase through the village, you and perhaps your family members yelling, "My bees! My bees!" It must have been quite the spectacle, and occasionally the source of some rather heated neighborly discussions. I saw them first, but they landed on my pear tree. Some legal codes were more specific. For instance, certain Germanic laws stipulated that if a swarm settled on an occupied property, the beekeeper had the right to enter that property to retrieve it, provided they made reasonable efforts to avoid damage. However, they might be liable for any damage caused during the retrieval, e.g., if they had to cut a branch. If the swarm settled in an empty or uncultivated area, the first person to hive it generally became the owner. Historians still argue about the degree of uniformity in these laws across different regions of medieval Europe, as local customs often held sway. What was accepted practice in an English village might differ from a French or German one. There were also laws concerning wild bees found in trees on someone else's land. Generally, the bees and their honey belonged to the landowner. If you, as a skilled beekeeper, discovered a bee tree on, say, the lord of the manor's land, you couldn't just chop it down and take the honey. You'd likely need permission, and often the lord would claim a significant share of the honey and wax, or you might act as his agent in collecting it. Some lords specifically reserved the rights to all bee trees on their estates. The placement of apiaries could also sometimes be subject to local rules or customs, especially if they were close to public paths or neighbors' properties. While bees were generally valued, a large apiary too close to a busy area could lead to complaints if people were frequently stung. You'd need to be a good neighbor, perhaps situating your skeps in a more secluded part of your land, or ensuring there were hedges or fences to encourage the bees to fly up and over pathways. Common sense and good relations usually prevailed, but disputes could arise. Theft of bees or honey was, of course, a serious offense. Stealing a skep of bees was not just theft of the honey and wax within, but of the colony itself, the means of future production. Punishments could be severe, ranging from fines to physical penalties, depending on the value of the goods stolen and the local legal system. One quirky legal aspect found in some early Irish laws, the Brehon Laws, is the detailed valuation given to bee colonies and their products, with specific fines for theft or damage, indicating their considerable economic importance. These laws even distinguished between different types of swarms, e.g., a prime swarm versus a later, smaller caste. Liability for stings was another interesting area. If your bee stung someone, were you responsible? Generally, since bees were considered wild by nature, a beekeeper wasn't automatically liable unless negligence could be proven. For example, if you deliberately agitated your bees and they then attacked someone. Or if you sited your apiary in a recklessly dangerous place. However, this was often a gray area, and much would depend on local interpretation and the circumstances. You'd probably try to smooth things over with an apology and perhaps a small pot of honey if your bees were implicated in a stinging incident. Good community relations were always preferable to a legal tangle. These legal frameworks, whether formal written laws or unwritten local customs, provided a structure for managing the sometimes unruly nature of beekeeping. They sought to balance the rights of the beekeeper with the rights of landowners and the wider community. For you, knowing these rules of the swarm was as important as knowing how to calm a colony with smoke. It helped you protect your livelihood, navigate potential conflicts, and operate within the accepted social and legal boundaries of your medieval world. Your secret life wasn't lived in a vacuum. It was subject to the same human concerns for property, fairness, and order that governed all aspects of medieval society. While you toil away in your own little corner of medieval Europe, tending your straw skeps and navigating the unique challenges of your local environment, it's easy to imagine that your methods are the only way, the universal truth of beekeeping. But just as cultures and customs varied across the medieval world, so too did some of the specifics of apiculture. Your counterparts in sun-drenched Mediterranean lands, or in the vast forests of Eastern Europe, or even in the sophisticated Islamic world, might be managing their bees in subtly, or sometimes strikingly, different ways, all striving for that same golden harvest. Let's take a brief, imaginary journey beyond your village to glimpse a world of beekeepers operating under different skies and traditions. In the warmer climes of the Mediterranean, think parts of Spain, Italy, Greece, or the Byzantine Empire, beekeeping had an incredibly ancient lineage stretching back to the Egyptians, Greeks, and Romans. Here, while straw skeps were certainly known and used, horizontal log hives or pottery hives were also very common and in some areas preferred. These cylindrical hives made from hollowed-out logs, cork bark, or fired clay were often laid on their sides, sometimes stacked in rows or built into stone walls to form large apiaries. The advantage of these horizontal hives was that honey could often be harvested from one end without necessarily destroying the colony. The bees would typically store honey at the back of the long cylinder, while the brood nest was closer to the entrance. A beekeeper could carefully remove a clay disc or wooden board at the back of the hive, cut out the honeycombs, and then replace the cover, leaving the brood nest relatively undisturbed. This was a step towards a more sustainable harvest than the all-or-nothing approach often necessitated by upright skeps. These Mediterranean beekeepers also benefited from a different range of forage plants. The aromatic herbs of the garriga and maquis, thyme, rosemary, lavender, sage produced intensely flavored and highly prized honeys. The honey from Mount Hymettus in Greece, famous since antiquity for its thyme flavor, was still renowned in the medieval period and considered a luxury product. The milder winters in these regions also meant that bees might have a shorter period of confinement and could potentially forage for more of the year, though summer droughts could pose a challenge. If we travel eastward into the territories of the Byzantine Empire and further into the Islamic world, the Middle East, North Africa, and parts of Islamic Spain, we find a sophisticated tradition of beekeeping and a deep appreciation for honey. Arabic scholars and agricultural writers penned detailed treatises on beekeeping, building upon classical knowledge and adding their own observations. They described various hive types, including pottery jars, wooden boxes, and wicker cylinders often plastered with mud or dung, much like your own klumskeps. They discussed swarm management, pest control, and methods for harvesting honey and wax. Honey was a valued food, sweetener, and medicine in Islamic cultures, and mead, though alcoholic beverages were forbidden for Muslims, was sometimes made by non-Muslim communities within these lands, or honey was used to make other sweet, non-alcoholic drinks. One quirky detail from some Arabic texts is the meticulous advice given on how to locate wild bee colonies by observing the flight paths of bees to and from water sources. Moving north and east into the vast forests of Slavic and Germanic lands, areas of modern-day Germany, Poland, Russia, a very different form of beekeeping was prevalent: forest beekeeping or tree beekeeping. This involved managing wild bee colonies that had naturally established themselves in hollow trees or creating artificial cavities in living trees for bees to occupy. These tree hives or log gums were often high off the ground, offering protection from bears and other ground predators. The beekeeper, a skilled woodsman, would climb the tree using ropes or simple ladders, cut a small access door into the cavity, and harvest a portion of the honey, typically leaving enough for the colony to survive. This was a very extensive, rather than intensive, form of beekeeping, relying on the abundance of forest forage. It was less about managing individual colonies in an apiary and more about tending a series of natural or semi-natural hives scattered throughout the forest. Special tools were developed for this, including long-handled chisels and scoops for working inside the tree cavities. This tradition was incredibly long-lived, persisting in some remote areas of Eastern Europe for centuries. Even within Western Europe, there were regional variations. In Ireland and parts of Gaelic Scotland, for instance, where the climate was often cool and damp, beekeepers faced particular challenges. The ancient Brehon laws of Ireland, as we touched upon, had incredibly detailed sections on bees, outlining their value, ownership, and the fines for theft or damage, underscoring their importance in that society. They likely used straw or wicker skeps adapted to their local conditions, perhaps with extra emphasis on weatherproofing. The types of honey would also reflect the local flora: heather, bog myrtle, and various wildflowers. Historians still argue about the extent of knowledge exchange between beekeepers from these different regions during the medieval period. While long-distance trade and travel certainly occurred, think of pilgrims, merchants, crusaders, it's unclear how much specific beekeeping technology or practice was transmitted. Most beekeepers, like yourself, would have learned their craft locally through apprenticeship and tradition. However, ideas can travel in unexpected ways, and it's possible that innovations from one region slowly diffuse to others over time, adapted to fit local materials and conditions. What's clear is that humans across a vast swathe of the medieval world recognized the value of bees and developed ingenious ways to work with them. Whether you were tending pottery jars under a Mediterranean sun, climbing high into a forest giant in Poland, or carefully managing your straw skeps in an English village, you were part of a global, albeit disconnected, fraternity of apiarists. You all shared the same goal: to coax sweetness and light from these remarkable insects. The methods might differ, the climate might vary, the language of your bee charms might be unintelligible to one another, but the fundamental relationship, that blend of respect, utility, and wonder inspired by the honeybee, was a common thread. Your secret life, while feeling intensely personal and local, was also a small part of a much larger, older, and more diverse human story of partnership with the hive. As the seasons turn, each bringing its distinct tasks and anxieties, your life as a medieval beekeeper unfolds in a predictable yet ever-engaging cycle. It's a rhythm deeply intertwined with the natural world, a dance dictated by the needs of your bees and the generosity of the flowering landscape. The cyclical nature of your work, from the awakening buzz of spring to the quiet stillness of winter, defines your year, year after year, shaping your days, your thoughts, and your connection to the very pulse of the earth. The beekeeper's year truly begins not on a calendar date, but with the first stirrings of life after winter slumber. As the days lengthen and the first brave crocuses and snowdrops push through the thawing soil, you feel a corresponding stir of anticipation. This is the time of awakening and assessment. You'll approach your wintered skeps with a mixture of hope and trepidation. Are they still heavy enough? Is there a gentle hum from within? On the first mild, sunny days, you'll watch eagerly for those first cleansing flights, a sure sign that the colony has survived. You'll clear away any debris from around the skep entrances, ensuring the bees have easy passage. You might provide a source of clean water nearby, as they'll need it for raising new brood. This is also when you'd consolidate any colonies that are weak but still alive, perhaps uniting them if you didn't do so in the autumn, or making a mental note of which ones look strongest and most promising for the season ahead. Your heart lifts with every sign of renewed activity, another winter weathered. Then comes spring's vibrant rush, a period dominated by expansion and, of course, swarming. As the fruit trees burst into blossom and dandelions paint the meadows yellow, your colonies explode in population. Your focus shifts to managing this rapid growth and, crucially, to capturing those valuable swarms. Remember the tanging, the frantic chases, the careful hiving of new colonies? This is your primary spring activity. You're also busy preparing new skeps or mending old ones, ensuring you have enough housing for any new swarms you catch or for artificial swarms you might try to make. It's a time of high energy, long days, and the constant, exciting possibility of increasing your apiary. The air is buzzing, literally and figuratively, with potential. As spring transitions into summer, the golden season of flow arrives. This is when your bees are at their peak foraging activity, gathering nectar from the abundance of summer blooms, clover, lime, meadowsweet, and countless others. Your main task now is to ensure your bees have what they need: space, water, and protection from pests like wasps or threats like an opportunistic badger. You're hefting the skeps regularly, feeling them grow heavier with the accumulating honey. It's a period of watchful waiting, of hoping for good weather, not too wet, not too dry, that will allow your bees to maximize their collection. You're like a hopeful investor watching your sweet stocks rise. You might also be tending your garden, ensuring a succession of bee-friendly flowers are available near the apiary. Late summer and early autumn bring the sweet, sticky harvest. This is the culmination of the year's efforts, the time to reap the rewards. Whether you're using the sulfur pit for some colonies or attempting to drive bees from others, you're carefully taking the honey and beeswax. The air in your cottage is thick with the scent of honey as you crush and strain the combs. It's intensive, messy work, but immensely satisfying. You're also making critical decisions about which colonies to overwinter, selecting the strongest and best provisioned. This is also when you'd render down your beeswax into clean cakes and perhaps start a batch of mead fermenting with some of the freshly harvested honey. Following the harvest, the mood shifts to autumnal preparations for the coming cold. The days are shortening, the air is cooler. Your focus is now entirely on ensuring the survival of your chosen colonies. You're checking their stores, perhaps feeding them a little extra honey if a strong colony seems a bit light. You're ensuring the skeps are well plumed, perhaps adding extra insulation like straw or bracken, and moving them to their sheltered winter quarters. Entrances are reduced to keep out mice. It's a time of battening down the hatches, of doing everything in your power to protect your bees from winter's harshness. A sense of urgency underlies these tasks. And finally, winter settles in, a period of quiet vigilance and waiting. Your apiary is still, perhaps covered in a blanket of snow. The vibrant hum is gone, replaced by a watchful silence. Your active work with the bees is minimal now, beyond ensuring their shelters are secure against storms and predators. You might spend your time mending equipment, making new skeps for the spring, or perhaps focusing on other winter tasks unrelated to beekeeping. But your bees are never far from your thoughts. You listen for any untoward sounds from the apiary, hope for mild spells, and count the days until spring. Historians still argue about whether medieval beekeepers undertook any form of active winter feeding for truly desperate colonies in skeps, or if survival was purely down to autumn stores and luck. Your own practices might involve a hopeful prayer or two. This annual cycle, from the first flight of spring to the last heft of autumn, defines your existence. It's a rhythm that connects you intimately to the seasons, to the life cycle of your bees, and to the very land itself. One quirky but poignant tradition in some beekeeping communities was to mark the beekeeper's year not by human calendars but by the events: the first swarm, the main honey flow, the last foraging flight. This highlights how deeply your perception of time was shaped by your charges. Each phase of the cycle brings its own challenges, its own rewards, and its own unique kind of satisfaction. There's a profound sense of continuity in this work, a feeling of participating in something ancient and essential. Year after year, the hum returns, the honey flows, and the cycle begins anew, a sweet and enduring pattern in your secret life. As you move through your cyclical life, deeply immersed in the practicalities of managing your buzzing charges, you might not always be consciously aware of it, but the bees, their hives, and their precious products are leaving their mark far beyond your apiary. They are being woven into the very fabric of medieval culture, immortalized in art, sung about in ballads, and even carved into the enduring stone of great buildings. Your humble craft, seemingly small and secretive, actually resonates through the creative and intellectual expressions of the age, a testament to the bee's enduring power to capture the human imagination. Look around you in the grandest cathedral or the humblest parish church. The flickering light illuminating the sacred space, the light that allows the priest to read from the holy book, the light that guides the monks in their scriptorium as they copy ancient texts. That light, as we know, often comes from beeswax candles. The very act of worship, of creating and preserving knowledge, is facilitated by your bees. Beyond the practical, the candle itself, made from the purest product of these supposedly chaste insects, becomes a symbol of divine light and purity. Artists depicting religious scenes would often include candles, their gentle glow rendered with care, an indirect nod to the bee's contribution. In illuminated manuscripts, those painstaking works of art created in monastic scriptoria, bees themselves sometimes make an appearance. You might find a beautifully detailed bee, perhaps with surprisingly accurate little hairy legs, buzzing in the margins of a psalter or a book of hours. Sometimes they are part of a larger natural scene, other times they might be included for their symbolic value, emblems of industry, order, or even resurrection, as bees were sometimes thought to die in winter and be reborn in spring. The artists, often monks who might have tended the monastery's own hives, would have had ample opportunity to observe bees firsthand. Their intricate, jewel-like portrayals elevate the bee from a mere insect to a subject worthy of artistic devotion. Then there's the architecture. While you might not see a giant stone skep adorning the local church, though that would be quite something, the influence is more subtle. Bosses, ornamental carvings at the intersection of ceiling ribs, or decorative elements in stonework or wood carvings within churches and important buildings sometimes feature hexagonal patterns reminiscent of honeycomb, or even stylized bees or beehives. These might be symbolic, referencing the industry of the congregation or the sweetness of God's word, or perhaps they were simply inspired by the beautiful and efficient geometry of the comb, a natural form that appealed to the medieval craftsman's eye. Historians still argue about the precise intended symbolism of some of these more abstract hexagonal designs. Are they definitely bee-related, or just a pleasing geometric motif? Regardless, the visual language of the hive occasionally finds its way into the enduring structures of the age. In secular art and tapestries, especially those depicting pastoral scenes or allegories of the seasons, bees and skeps can also be found. A scene of springtime might show a beekeeper hiving a swarm, the iconic straw skep clearly visible. An allegory of industry might feature busy bees as a central motif. These images reinforce the bee's association with diligence, abundance, and the well-ordered agricultural life. Beyond the visual arts, bees hum their way through medieval literature and song. We've mentioned Beowulf and its mead halls, but references to honey, mead, and bees appear in countless poems, songs, and proverbs. Honey is the standard for sweetness, mead the drink of celebration. Bees are lauded for their wisdom and their tireless work. Chaucer, in the Canterbury Tales, makes references to bees. For example, in the Nun's Priest's Tale, the chaotic chase after the fox Chanticleer is compared to the noise made when chasing a swarm of bees. This shows that the image of tanging for a swarm was a familiar one to his audience. Fables and bestiaries, medieval books describing animals, both real and mythical, often with moral lessons attached, frequently included entries on bees. These texts would repeat and popularize the classical and medieval beliefs about bee society: the king bee, their chastity, their organized labor, their loyalty. These stories, read by the literate and perhaps recounted orally to others, helped to shape the popular understanding and perception of bees, reinforcing their symbolic importance. One quirky and perhaps less direct way bees influenced medieval culture was through the very language used. Words related to bees, honey, and wax became ingrained in the vocabulary. Think of terms like honeymoon, which some etymologists suggest might have ancient roots connected to the practice of drinking mead for a month after a wedding to ensure fertility and happiness, though the exact origin is debated. Or simply the everyday use of honey as a term of endearment. Even in heraldry, the system of coats of arms used by noble families and institutions, bees occasionally appear as charges on shields. A bee or a beehive on a coat of arms could symbolize industry, diligence, and well-ordered governance, qualities that a family or a town might wish to associate with themselves. So, while you're out in your apiary focused on the practicalities of your craft, remember that the hum of your bees echoes far beyond your garden fence. It resonates in the scholarly texts being copied by candlelight, in the sermons being preached from the pulpit, in the songs being sung in taverns and halls, and in the intricate details adorning the grand buildings that define the medieval landscape. Your secret life, in its quiet way, contributes to a rich cultural tapestry, ensuring that the bee, in all its industrious and symbolic glory, is remembered and celebrated in word, image, and stone. It's a rather nice thought, isn't it? Your little buzzing charges, making their mark on history. The years have turned, season flowing into season, each one marked by the familiar rhythms of your apiary. The sharp chill of countless dawns has given way to the golden warmth of innumerable summer afternoons spent in the company of your buzzing charges. Your hands, once soft and unaccustomed to the work, are now gnarled and calloused, bearing the faint, silvery scars of 1,000 stings, badges of honor in your secret profession. Your back might be a little more stooped from bending over skeps, your eyes perhaps a little dimmer, but your connection to the bees, that deep, intuitive understanding, has only deepened with the passage of time. You are no longer the hesitant apprentice, but a seasoned master of the craft, your life a testament to the sweet rewards and quiet wisdom found within the hive. As you walk through your apiary now, perhaps a little more slowly than in your youth, the hum of the bees is more than just a sound, it's the soundtrack of your life. Each skep, some older and patched, others newer and still fragrant with fresh straw, holds memories. You recall the bumper harvest of that one legendary summer when the honey seemed to flow like a river and every skep was almost too heavy to lift. You remember the anxiety of a particularly harsh winter when you feared you'd lose them all, and the profound relief when spring revealed their survival. You think of the swarms you've chased, the mead you've brewed, the satisfaction of trading your honey and wax at market for the necessities of life. These memories are as golden and precious as the honey itself. You've seen changes over your lifetime. Perhaps new families have moved into the village, new lords have taken over the manor. Children you once saw playing in the lane are now grown with families of their own. But the bees, they remain remarkably constant, their ancient patterns of life repeating year after year. Their society, as you understand it, with its king and loyal workers, continues its tireless efforts, a small, stable point in a changing world. You've passed on your knowledge, perhaps to a son or daughter, or to a keen young apprentice from the village, just as an older keeper once passed it on to you. You've shared the secrets of skep making, of reading the mood of the hive, of knowing when to harvest and how to prepare for winter. You've tried to instill in them not just the practical skills, but also the respect and wonder that these creatures deserve. The continuity of the craft, the passing of knowledge from one generation to the next, was essential for the survival of beekeeping itself, especially in an era with few written manuals accessible to common folk. You reflect on the legacy of your work. It's not a grand legacy of castles built or battles won, the kind that fills the chronicles of kings and nobles. Yours is a quieter, sweeter legacy. It's in the candles that lit the church, allowing for prayer and learning. It's in the honey that sweetened the food of your neighbors, that perhaps soothed a child's cough or brought comfort to an old man. It's in the mead that fueled celebrations and warmed winter nights. It's in the very pollination that your bees provided, unseen and unthanked for the most part, yet vital for the fruit trees in the orchards and the wild berries in the hedgerows. Historians still argue about the extent to which medieval people consciously understood the full role of bees in pollination, but they certainly recognized their value for honey and wax. You've lived a life attuned to the subtle signals of nature, a life of patience and careful observation. You've learned the language of the hum, the dance of the foragers, the scent of a healthy hive. You've faced down fear, endured pain, and found profound satisfaction in a job well done. Your world has been small, perhaps centered on your cottage, your garden, your apiary, and the local market town. But within that small world, you have been a vital part, a producer of valuable goods, a keeper of ancient knowledge. One quirky and rather poignant folk belief sometimes encountered is that when a beekeeper dies, someone must go and tell the bees, very gently, who their new master or mistress will be. If this isn't done, it's said the bees might mourn themselves to death or fly away, unwilling to serve a stranger without proper introduction. Whether you believe this literally or not, it speaks to the deep, almost personal bond that was felt to exist between the beekeeper and their colonies. They were more than just livestock, they were a responsibility, a community you were part of. As the sun begins to set on your long life, casting long shadows across the familiar landscape of your apiary, the hum of the bees seems to soften, to become more gentle, almost a lullaby. The scent of beeswax and old honey, a perfume that has clung to you for decades, feels comforting. You are tired, your body weary from years of labor, but there's a deep contentment in your soul. You have lived a full life, a useful life, a life intimately connected to these extraordinary creatures. The secret life of the medieval beekeeper may not have brought you fame or fortune, but it has brought you a unique richness, a sweet understanding of the intricate, buzzing heart of the world. And as the last light fades and the stars begin to prick the darkening sky, the gentle hum of your beloved bees is the final, peaceful sound you hear, a lasting sweetness in the fading light. The work of your hands, the knowledge you've shared, the subtle ways your bees have touched the lives of those around you. These things linger, a quiet legacy carried on the wind, as sweet and enduring as honey itself. The cycle will continue, the bees will fly, and new hands will learn to tend them, building upon the foundations you so carefully laid. Your time among the hives is drawing to a gentle close, but the vibrant life you nurtured will buzz on, a constant, golden thread in the tapestry of the world. And so, as the story of our medieval beekeeper comes to a peaceful end, may you too feel a sense of gentle quietude. The world of strawskeps and buzzing colonies, of honey harvests and winter preparations now fades into the soft edges of your awareness. Allow the resonant hum that has accompanied our journey to become a soothing vibration, lulling your mind into a state of deep relaxation. Let the worries and concerns of your own day recede, replaced by the simple, enduring rhythms of a life lived in close harmony with nature. Imagine the last golden rays of a medieval sunset casting a warm glow over a peaceful apiary, the air still carrying the faint, sweet scent of honey and beeswax. Feel the coolness of the evening air beginning to settle, a signal for rest and restoration. There is nothing more for you to do now but to let go, to allow your body to become heavy and your mind to become still. The bees are settled in their hives, and you too can settle into the comfort of your bed. Any lingering thoughts can drift away like pollen on a gentle breeze, unimportant and distant. As you surrender to the approaching slumber, may your dreams be filled with fields of fragrant clover and the gentle warmth of sunshine. May you find a sweet tranquility, a peaceful passage into the quiet hours of the night. The story is told, the work is done. Now it is simply time to rest, to recharge, and to dream.